Long before maps were printed and borders were fixed, a ribbon of trade and culture stitched together the world from the East China Sea to the Mediterranean, and it began with a single, astonishing commodity: silk. Silk did not arrive fully formed as a highway. It arrived as a secret, a luxury, a whisper of shimmering fabric that flowed out of villages in the valleys of northern China. That whisper would gather into caravans and fleets, into songs and stories, into the bones of cities that grew along the way. Join us as we follow silk's secret beginnings. Subscribe and tell us in the comments whether its story fascinates you more as a hidden luxury or as the thread that built cities. To tell the story of the Silk Road, we must first go to where silk itself was born, among mulberry leaves and small, patient hands. In the damp softness of river valleys, well before emperors or merchants mapped the idea of a road, sericulture was being perfected, a craft of coaxing silk from the cocoons of tiny worms. This was not the work of a single inventor, but of generations who learned how to feed, weave, and keep the secret of the moth's thread close, because secrecy meant power and wealth. From those valleys, silk became both cloth and currency, a material that bore the name of places it never had to see to change them. It crossed borders, stitched into garments, negotiated in markets, and braided into the rituals of courts far from the mulberry trees. Its value was not merely economic. Silk was fragile and luminous and therefore desirable, a token of refinement and connection. The demand for it in the West would knit people into networks they had not imagined. If silk was the lure, the roads were a tapestry of paths that emerged as habit and necessity. The word road evokes a single paved way, but the Silk Road was a network, a collage of trails, river passages, sea lanes, and mountain tracks that shifted with seasons and politics. Caravans picked routes to avoid bandits or bad weather and to take advantage of oases where water and trade goods could be exchanged for news and companionship. Over time, these seasonal choices hardened into established routes, and villages at junctions grew into towns whose names would become famous. Geography shaped the Silk Road as much as desire did, forging channels where people and goods moved most easily. To the north lay vast steppe, open and mobile, where mounted nomads could be allies or threats depending on the moment. To the south and west rose great deserts, deserts that privileged the brave and the well-provisioned while rewarding careful planning with safe passage and commerce. Between these extremes, river valleys and mountain passes became the arteries of connection, and the world mapped itself along these arteries. As paths became habitual, bridges of culture developed. Languages, religions, technologies, and artistic styles traveled along with silk and spices, grafting a shared cosmopolitanism onto places that otherwise might have remained isolated. A sculptor in a Central Asian city might emulate motifs carved in a distant monastery. A cooking technique could arrive alongside a new grain. Even stories migrated, carried in the pockets of merchants. The Silk Road was less a singular trade route than a living organism, a system of exchange where things flowed in multiple directions and where arrival and adaptation were constant. The early political actors on this stage were local powers, kingdoms, and tribes who controlled segments of the road, offering protection in exchange for tribute and profit. In China, the Han Dynasty extended its influence outward, seeing in trade not just commerce but strategic advantage. Ambassadors and traders traveled westward under imperial auspices, establishing relations with kingdoms beyond the deserts in hopes of curbing the influence of dangerous neighbors and expanding markets for Chinese goods. This interplay of diplomacy and commerce turned the road into an instrument of statecraft as much as a conduit of goods. To the west, the Parthians and later the Sasanians would come to dominate large stretches of the Middle East, acting as intermediaries between Asian manufacturers and Mediterranean consumers. These empires were adept at levying tolls and taxes, at maintaining caravan stations, and at facilitating the flow of goods across their territories. Their cities thrummed with traders from many lands, and their courts received luxury items for display and diplomacy. In this way, the Silk Road became a series of interdependent economies where the prosperity of one city often relied on the safe passage arranged by another. But the road was not only a conduit for luxury goods, it became a vector for ideas and technologies that transformed distant societies. Paper, invented in China, traveled westward and revolutionized record-keeping and the spread of literature in lands that had never seen a sheet like it. From India and the Near East came numerals and mathematical concepts that would ease trade and build empires. Equally important were less tangible technologies, ways of organizing caravans, of storing water, of negotiating credit and trust across cultures. The Silk Road taught the world how to be interconnected. Religions also moved along these routes, finding adherents and making new forms of expression as they encountered local cultures. Buddhism left the Ganges and traveled eastward into Central Asia and China, carried by monks and merchants who built monastic centers and oasis towns. Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism spread along the western axis during earlier centuries, while later Islam would sweep across much of the Middle East and into parts of Central Asia. Each faith adapted to and reshaped the urban landscapes it entered, creating syncretic practices and hybrid art that can still be seen in archaeological remains. The peoples who lived along the Silk Road were not merely passive conduits, they were active interpreters and brokers, chief among them the Sogdians. These Iranian-speaking merchants from the region we now call Uzbekistan and Tajikistan became the backbone of long-distance trade, their caravans linking Chang'an with Antioch and beyond. They established networks of agents in distant cities, founded trading houses, and functioned as cultural mediators. The Sogdians wrote letters, negotiated marriages, and turned disparate markets into a cohesive commercial system that could navigate linguistic and cultural differences. Alongside the Sogdians were the nomads of the steppe, whose mobility and martial prowess could make or break caravans. They traded in horses, hides, and slaves, and they served as crucial middlemen for goods moving between settled empires. Sometimes they exacted tribute, sometimes they protected routes, and other times they incorporated themselves into the economies of towns they once raided. The drama of their interactions with empires is a constant undercurrent of Silk Road history, with alliances and conflicts shaping the ebb and flow of trade. Cities rose at strategic points and became more than depots for goods. They became centers of production, learning, and art. Samarkand and Bokhara, Kashgar and Turfan, these names evoke bustling bazaars, noisy caravanserais, and scholars debating philosophy in shaded courtyards. These urban centers minted coins, issued credit, and hosted religious festivals that drew participants from distant regions. Their prosperity often depended on their ability to mediate between the customs and currencies of travelers, turning hospitality into a form of commerce. Maritime lanes eventually augmented the overland routes, and the idea of a single Silk Road expanded to include sea routes that connected East Asian ports to Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa. Ships carried bulk goods and spices more economically than caravans could, and maritime silk routes linked coastal cities into the same web of exchange. This maritime expansion did not replace the inland roads but complemented them, providing alternative pathways when overland travel was too dangerous or too expensive. The world of trade accordingly became three-dimensional, layered with sea, river, and desert. The rewards of this commerce were enormous, but the costs and risks were equally real. Caravans moved slowly, exposed to weather, disease, and theft, and merchants had to cultivate networks of trust to keep their ventures viable. Letters of credit, agent networks, and even early forms of insurance developed as responses to these perils. Trust itself became a trade good. The reputation of a family or a city could determine whether a merchant received credit, and that reputation was often preserved through elaborate rituals of hospitality and shared legal norms. When an envoy from the Western Han Dynasty reached Central Asia and encountered Fergana horses, they did not simply buy animals, they embarked on exchanges that altered military and political capabilities. Horses moved along the Silk Road enhanced the mobility of armies, and the spread of cavalry tactics reshaped warfare across Eurasia. Military needs sometimes drove trade as much as commercial curiosity did, because empires sought to secure superior animals, weaponry, and intelligence from afar. The entanglement of military and commercial aims would continue to mark the road's history. As centuries passed, the Silk Road evolved with the rise and fall of empires. When the Mongols created a vast empire in the 13th century, they temporarily made the road easier to travel by imposing a relatively unified rule across much of Eurasia. The Pax Mongolica allowed caravans to move with fewer tolls and hazards, and merchants thrived. Yet this peace was contingent and did not erase the long-running cycles of fragmentation and realignment that characterized the region. The Mongol period also accelerated the exchange of knowledge on an unprecedented scale. Chinese technologies such as gunpowder and printing reached the West in new ways, while Persian and Arab astronomy influenced Chinese scholars. Envoys, artisans, and religious figures traveled back and forth under Mongol auspices, making the Silk Road a laboratory of cultural fusion. At the same time, the human cost of Mongol conquests, including mass displacements and violence, reminds us that connections sometimes came at terrible price. As trade intensified, the physical infrastructure of the road improved in parts, with caravanserais, inns designed for caravans, springing up at regular intervals. These places offered shelter, food, and markets, and they served as nodes of information exchange where stories, news, and rumors circulated as freely as goods. Caravanserais shaped the rhythm of travel, traders timed their journeys to reach these safe havens, and the very existence of these stops enabled routes to persist across inhospitable terrain. They were social spaces as much as logistical ones. In parallel with these physical networks, financial instruments developed that allowed trade to scale beyond what coin alone could support. Bills of exchange and credit notes permitted merchants to move wealth without lugging bullion across deserts, and this sophistication fostered longer-range investments. Banking houses in places like Venice and Genoa emerged on the far western fringes of Silk Road connectivity, tying the economies of the Mediterranean into the larger Eurasian system. That financial entanglement would later play a role in global voyages of exploration. The Silk Road's influence on art was profound, producing hybrid visual languages that spread across continents. Motifs traveled with goods, inspiring artists from China to Rome to incorporate foreign patterns into local traditions. Buddhist iconography, for example, took on Hellenistic features when it passed through the Greco-Bactrian cultural zone, and Chinese tomb art absorbed Central Asian musical instruments and clothing styles. This cross-pollination created an aesthetic web that scholars call syncretic, but to people living at the time it simply reflected the variety of the world around them. Language itself became a vehicle of commerce and adaptation. Traders often learned pidgins and lingua francas, and scripts moved with them. The spread of Aramaic and later Sogdian as commercial languages smoothed the way for transactions across ethnic lines. Translators and scribes were prized, because the ability to render a contract into multiple languages could decide the success of a venture. Over time, the Silk Road fostered polyglot societies where multilingualism was an economic asset. The movement of plants, animals, and crops along the road had long-lasting consequences for agriculture and cuisine across continents. Crops like wheat, grapes, and fruit varieties shifted in range, while silkworms remained primarily an Asian secret until they were smuggled out in later eras. These biological exchanges reshaped diets and livelihoods, altering the ecological balance of regions as new species found new homes. Farmers and cooks, not just kings, played their part in the story of globalization. Medical knowledge also traveled. Texts and remedies moved alongside merchants and scholars. Physicians in different lands borrowed treatments, compiled pharmacopoeias, and translated Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Chinese medical works into local tongues. The cross-cultural exchange in medicine enriched practices and sometimes introduced dangerous curiosities, but it broadened the scope of healing and knowledge about the human body. In this way, the Silk Road was as much a hospital as it was a marketplace. One of the most dramatic consequences of cross-continental travel was the spread of disease, a shadow side of connectivity that would have devastating effects at times. Plagues and epidemics could lead vast distances more quickly when people and goods moved more frequently, and the historical record bears witness to pandemics that followed trade routes. This grim reality informs how we think about connectivity today, reminding us that interdependence has both benefits and vulnerabilities. Yet even amid such dangers, the allure of the Silk Road continued to grow, because the road represented possibility and prestige. European interest in reaching Asia intensified in the later medieval period as demand for spices and silk rose, leading to voyages of exploration that would eventually link the Atlantic and Pacific worlds. Merchants, monarchs, and adventurers all sought new ways to participate in the profitable exchange that had once been the domain of overland caravans. This shift began to redirect global trade and change the balance of power among regions. The arrival of Europeans in Asian markets did not immediately end the overland routes, but it did contribute to a reorientation of trade. Maritime technologies developed in the Mediterranean and beyond allowed large ships to carry bulk goods more cheaply, and colonial empires began to control production and distribution in ways that undercut the older networks. The decline of certain overland routes was gradual and uneven, and new centers rose even as others faded. The Silk Road's decline was part structural, part political, and part technological. Even as its commercial primacy waned, the cultural legacy of the Silk Road endured, woven into the fabrics of cities and nations. Languages retained borrowed words, cuisines kept imported spices, artistic traditions persisted in syncretic forms that bore invisible testaments to centuries of travel. Religious communities that had once spread along the roads continued to exist in places that had been stops on ancient caravans. The Silk Road left traces that modern scholars and travelers still find in architecture, pottery, and tales told by grandmothers. The modern rediscovery of the Silk Road has been both archaeological and literary, as explorers and scholars sought to reconstruct the networks from fragmentary ruins and texts. Travelers in the 19th and 20th centuries mapped caravan routes and unearthed treasures that confirmed the scale of exchange. Yet the road is not merely a subject for museums and journals, it is a living route in many regions, where people still trade, move, and maintain customs that echo the past. Studying these continuities helps us understand the long arcs of human connectivity. Archaeologists have revealed surprising details about daily life along the Silk Road, from pottery used in tea houses to the skeletal remains that tell of diets and diseases. Excavations at oasis towns show layers upon layers of habitation, each layer a different chapter in the town's life as trade waxed and waned. The material record complements written histories and helps correct biases that favor elites. Objects speak of ordinary travelers, artisans, and families who kept the road alive. While empires and merchants certainly shaped the arc of the Silk Road, the stories of women and minorities remind us that the road's social fabric was complex. Women participated as producers of textiles, as traders, and sometimes as landowners and diplomats. Their roles varied across regions and eras, but were never insignificant. Archaeological finds and documents occasionally illuminate lives that centralized histories tend to overlook. These glimpses enrich the narrative and complicate simplistic images of caravan life. The Silk Road also fostered new philosophical and intellectual currents as ideas collided and synthesized. Debates about belief and governance mixed with commercial concerns, creating intellectual nodes in cities where scholars from different traditions argued, learned, and translated. Libraries and academies could be as cosmopolitan as markets, drawing manuscripts that spanned languages and eras. In such places, the Silk Road functioned as a university without walls. Music and performance traveled too, and musicians carried tunes and instruments that left audibly detectable imprints across continents. A melody could travel with a caravan and be adopted into local repertoires, shifting in rhythm and ornamentation as it moved. This musical exchange created a shared cultural memory that transcended linguistic barriers and is often preserved in folk traditions today. Listening to regional music can, in a sense, be a way of retracing the Silk Road. The personal experiences of merchants were varied and often precarious, marked by long months of travel, negotiation, and risk. Letters and account books reveal how traders priced goods, recorded debts, and wrote of lost cargo or grateful patronage. These documents convey not only the economic calculations but also the human stories, homesickness, joy at a profitable sale, friendships made in caravanserais. Personal narratives bring an intimacy to the broader sweep of history. One of the most evocative facets of the road is the caravan itself, a moving microcosm of society composed of drivers, guards, merchants, artisans, and animals. Camels and horses were essential partners, and their needs, water, grazing, rest, dictated the pace and rhythm of journeys. Caravans followed stars and tracks, timed their departures with seasonal winds, and negotiated with local powers for safe passage, creating a choreography of travel synchronized with time and terrain. The aesthetic of the Silk Road left a particular imprint on material culture, with textiles often incorporating foreign dyes and techniques that showcased a city's cosmopolitan tastes. Dyers in Central Asia experimented with colors and patterns that reflected both local sensibilities and distant fashions. Textile fragments recovered from tombs show how designs migrated and were reinterpreted, turning cloth into a visual map of contact and exchange. As the years progressed, the Silk Road's governance shifted between centralized control and local autonomy, reflecting the changing capabilities and priorities of empires. When strong states enforced security and standardized coinage, trade expanded. When states fractured, routes fragmented, and local powers filled the vacuum. This fluctuation is part of what makes the Silk Road's history a story of cycles. Prosperity begets infrastructure, which begets vulnerability to outside pressures, which begets reconfiguration. Calendars and seasonal rhythms governed much of the Silk Road's life, because travel depended on rivers being navigable, mountain passes being clear of snow, and deserts having known water points. Merchants became adept at reading climatic cues and at building seasonal businesses that exploited windows of safe passage. This intimate knowledge of environment made Silk Road traders not only entrepreneurs but also early ecological managers who had to adapt to changing landscapes. Language, religion, and law intersected in the making of contracts that could be enforced across thousands of kilometers, often through mutual recognition among cities and guilds. The norms that allowed traders to trust one another included shared legal practices and, at times, formal treaties that regulated weights, measures, and punishments for theft. In the absence of a single supranational authority, these norms functioned as the rules of a sprawling commercial community. The Silk Road also left an enduring mythic quality in the European imagination, with tales of Prester John, Sheba's Gold, and a fabulous East that combined fact and fantasy. Such myths fueled curiosity, ambition, and voyages that would eventually reshape global history. The interplay of reality and legend shows how trade and storytelling reinforced each other, as goods inspired tales, and tales inspired new travels. In modern times, renewed interest in the Silk Road has inspired both scholarly research and grand political projects that echo its connectivity. Initiatives to build new infrastructure, whether roads, railways, or pipelines, claim the mantle of revitalizing ancient connections, promising economic integration and geopolitical influence. These modern recreations are not simple revivals of the past, they are new networks shaped by contemporary technologies and power dynamics. Still, they draw on the same impulses that created the Silk Road, a desire to connect, to trade, and to share knowledge. The archaeology of the Silk Road has yielded extraordinary finds: Buddhist murals, coins bearing distant emperors' faces, and intricate textiles that survived buried in sands. Each discovery acts like a letter from the past, revealing trade relationships, aesthetic exchanges, and daily rituals. Careful interpretation of these finds has allowed historians to reconstruct routes, economic volumes, and cultural interactions that written sources alone could not supply. Histories of the Silk Road must also contend with the limits of sources, because those who kept records were often elites or literate minorities whose voices do not represent the whole. Where material culture fills gaps, it does not always provide names or personal stories, and where texts speak, they sometimes exaggerate or omit. The best histories therefore weave together multiple strands: archaeology, numismatics, local chronicles, and oral traditions, creating a richer, though still partial, understanding. The Silk Road's environmental history is another necessary thread, because trade shaped landscapes as people dug wells, planted orchards, and built caravanserais that altered water tables and vegetation. Oasis towns flowered where humans engineered water resources, and their rise often depended on long-term maintenance beyond the capacities of a single generation. The environmental consequences of trade thus remind us that human systems are inseparable from ecological ones. Education and the transmission of knowledge along the Silk Road had far-reaching consequences, as scholars collected texts and translated them into other languages. Centers of learning became repositories where Greek philosophy met Buddhist contemplations, where medical treatises were compared and tested, and where mathematics and astronomy were shared. The cumulative effect of these exchanges was a global intellectual milieu that gradually reshaped sciences and metaphysics in many regions. The story of commodities beyond silk, spices, precious stones, ceramics, and metals shows how varied the road's traffic could be. Spices added flavor and preserved food, while precious metals financed wars and built palaces. Each category of goods carried with it stories about production, labor, and social organization far from the markets where they were sold, tying together disparate economies into systemic relations. Not all traffic on the Silk Road was peaceful or consensual. Slaves were bought and sold, and human trafficking was a grim reality in some periods. The presence of slave markets reveals the darker aspects of the global economy, where human beings were commodities in a trade that fed empires and households alike. This dimension complicates any romanticized view of the Silk Road, reminding listeners that economic prosperity often coexisted with human suffering. Yet amid trade and tragedy, the Silk Road remains an enduring symbol of human curiosity, ingenuity, and adaptability. It demonstrates how people create networks that fit their needs, invent financial instruments to mitigate risk, and craft cultural forms that travel with them. The road's history is not a single narrative of progress but a tapestry of interactions, innovations, and contradictions that together made the medieval world more interconnected than ever before. The role of frontier communities in this story is crucial because they often acted as translators of goods and customs. Those living at the edges between empires developed flexible identities and languages that let them navigate shifting allegiances and markets. Their lives show how hybrid identities can be sources of resilience and cultural innovation in times of change. In literature and art, the Silk Road is often portrayed as a line of adventure, and yet its reality was often quieter: mundane repairs on the side of a road, the negotiation of price under a tent, the waiting for a favorable wind. These quotidian activities underpin the grand narratives of exploration and trade, and learning to value them helps us appreciate how ordinary choices shape large-scale patterns. The romance of the Silk Road rests on many small, patient labors. The historians who reconstruct the Silk Road must also interpret silence as data, where records are missing. Patterns of settlement, language, and pottery distribution suggest invisible connections that once existed. This method of reading between the lines requires a humility about certainty and an openness to multiple explanations. The Silk Road resists simple conclusions, and its complexity is part of what makes it endlessly fascinating. When modern travelers walk the ruins of caravanserais or sit in the shade of a mulberry tree in an old silk-producing valley, they encounter layers of time that remain palpable. Stones warmed by centuries of footsteps, faded frescoes, and fragments of pottery all testify to a past that was both bustling and fragile. To encounter these places is to sense the human rhythms that sustained a transcontinental web of exchange. The idea of a Silk Road has inspired contemporary art, music, and film, often as a metaphor for connection and exchange. Creatives use its imagery to explore migration, hybridity, and memory. Such modern treatments sometimes mythologize the past, but often provoke useful questions about identity and belonging in an interconnected world. Art keeps the conversation about the Silk Road alive, reinterpreting its meanings for new audiences. Because the Silk Road was a network, it never truly ended. Its spirit survives in modern supply chains, international diplomacy, and cultural exchanges that continue to span continents. Information now moves at the speed of light, but the fundamental human instincts that built the Silk Road, curiosity, profit, and the desire for connection, remain unchanged. Understanding those instincts helps us navigate our own era of complex interdependence. In reflecting on the Silk Road's origins and legacy, it is important to remember that history is not a single river but a braided system of currents. Silk was the lure that drew disparate peoples into contact, but what arose from those contacts was more than commerce. It was the slow accretion of shared practices, technologies, and stories. In tracing those threads, we see how small innovations, like a better loan or a more secure legal form, ripple outward to transform societies. The narrative of the Silk Road also teaches us about contingency, the sense that chance meetings, clever individuals, or sudden political shifts could redirect the course of exchange. A single caravan seized by pirates, a treaty signed by an ambitious king, or a bad harvest could reroute centuries of trade. These contingencies remind us that history is not deterministic but responsive to human choices and unforeseen events. At its genesis, the Silk Road grew from the desire to connect and the luxury of leisure that allowed some to seek goods from afar. Over millennia, it matured into a network that profoundly influenced world history. Its origins are humble, its history complex and often violent, yet its legacy persists in the cultures and cities that once stood on its margins. As we move forward, the lessons of the Silk Road remain relevant. Connectivity brings opportunity and risk, and the human capacity to adapt shapes the outcomes. To follow the Silk Road today is to step into a palimpsest of migrations, inventions, and human stories, a living museum of contact where stones and stories converse. Each traveler adds a new footnote to an already dense manuscript of exchange, telling, buying, arguing, and resting in the same spots that once saw caravans pass in long, deliberate procession. The road is never just about goods, It is about the human need to reach beyond the familiar and to find value in the strange. As we draw closer to the end of this chapter yet keep the road open to further exploration, remember that the Silk Road's true marvel was its constancy and change. It was never static. It morphed with empires, technologies, and climates, always finding new ways to connect goods and ideas. This capacity to be remade, to incorporate and be reshaped by diverse actors, is a lesson in cultural resilience that still applies in our global moment. The Silk Road began as a whisper among mulberry trees and became an enormous conversation across continents, a human-made ecosystem where trade, faith, art, and politics mingled in unpredictable ways. Its origin lies in a craft and in curiosity, and its history is the record of countless decisions to trade, travel, and translate. To listen to that history is to hear the voices of caravan leaders, scribes, potters, and pilgrims who, across centuries, made the world smaller and richer in experience. Even now, when planes cross continents in hours and digital messages travel every minute, the Silk Road story invites us to slow down and consider the costs and rewards of connection. The silk thread that once drew kings' attention also traces the route of human imagination toward the unfamiliar. In following that thread, we learn not just about a road, but about the way humans make meaning across distance and difference. So the Silk Road remains both history and metaphor, history in its scratched stones and buried cities, and metaphor in its lesson that exchange shapes who we are. It began in practical necessity and rose into something grander, a conduit of identity and invention. To walk its paths, even in memory, is to engage with the world as a network of interlinked lives, each one a small, essential stitch in the great fabric of human connection. The caravan moved like a slow heartbeat across the skin of the desert, a measured rhythm of boots and hooves, of ropes whispering against saddles and the soft slap of fabric as merchants shifted under heavy burdens. Dust rose in a deliberate plume and folded itself back into the land, a private dust that belonged to nobody but them. To stand at the edge of a caravan was to watch time bend into a procession, centuries of trade, stories, and survival compacted into walking motion. The Silk Road was not a single road, but the sense of one lived and carried by those who dared to cross emptiness for the promise of exchange. I want you to imagine the way the horizon tilts when you travel on nomad time, when dawn arrives not as a clock's alarm but as a change in color and cold. Campfires are struck with fingers that know the right scrape and the right breath. Tents are raised as if memory alone dictates where poles belong. That memory is a map passed down through speech, through the positioning of stones, and through the scars of animal paths carved deeply into sand as if the desert itself had pen and ink. In the beginning, the Silk Road was an idea as much as a place, a web of paths that connected China's weaving looms to the markets of the Mediterranean, that linked the papermakers of Chang'an with the bead wielders of Antioch. It grew slowly, stitched together by traders, monks, soldiers, and court envoys who needed to carry goods and beliefs across vast emptiness. The routes evolved organically, sometimes hugging river valleys and sometimes daring the open steppe. They adjusted with seasons, with political alliances, and with the ephemeral patience of water. Caravans were the bloodstream of this network. A caravan's makeup changed with geography and with the goods it carried. In some stretches, 50 beasts might plod along under the command of a single leader who knew the desert by its breathing. In others, hundreds of animals answered the orders of a chain of caravan masters. People specialized: packers, camel drivers, interpreters, guards, cooks, and a few itinerant craftsmen who stitched leather and mended metal on the march. Camels are the practical poetry of desert travel. The Bactrian camel, with its 2 humps and shaggy coat, and the dromedary, single-humped and lean, were chosen by terrain and task. Their humps are not fuel tanks in the romantic sense, but reserves, a biologically efficient storage of fat that can be metabolized gradually and sustains life when forage is scarce. More than physiology, camels carry temperament. They are stubborn in a way that demands respect and that teaches travelers to be humble before the desert. Water defined the rhythm of every caravan. Oases were more than rest stops. They were lifeways, sovereign kingdoms within the sea of sand. Wells were contested property. Water rights were governed by custom and often by treaty. A caravan stopped at an oasis not only to drink but to renew social contracts, to trade tales and currency, and to acquire news vital to survival, which passes were blocked by wind-blown dunes, where brigands had been seen, which governor demanded a toll. The desert is a place in which silence and sound are measured differently. The wind composes ceaseless music against tents, shifting dunes into slow crescendos and decays. At night, the caravan sounds are amplified, the creak of leather, the clink of gear, the lowing of beasts, while the stars above seem both nearer and indifferent. Travelers navigated with stars, with the sun's position, and with the memory of geological marks carved into the earth, a natural GPS that taught generations how to find their way without a map on paper. Join the journey, subscribe and tell us in the comments. Would you rather follow the caravan's night sounds under endless stars or trace the dune's shapes under the blazing sun? Caravans were not casual affairs. They required planning, permission, and a firm knowledge of the political landscape. Lords and local rulers collected tolls, levied taxes, and exacted hospitality in equal measure. A safe passage could be purchased with silver, with promises of future favors, or with the careful placement of alliances. A caravan was a diplomatic mission as often as it was a commercial enterprise. Goods moved on the Silk Road in all directions, and silk was merely the most famous. Chinese silk glittered in Roman courts as proof that distant courts tended to craft and opulence. But silk is only a thread in the larger tapestry. Spices, glass, dyes, spices, precious metals, horses, jade, furs, and ideas, religion, technologies, stories, crossed borders as eagerly and destructively as armies. Each item carried with it a piece of the culture that produced it. A ceramic from Persia placed on a Chinese dining table changed the aesthetics of that space just as much as the taste of the food. Sogdian merchants were the logistic masters of the early trade networks. They came from cities in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and became the interpreters between cultures, both literally and figuratively. Their language served as commercial Esperanto across Central Asia, their caravans crisscrossed routes, and their tombstones tell the story of families who died far from home. The Sogdians established a reputation for networking. Their bazaars were nodes where news and goods flowed freely, lubricated by their ability to negotiate in multiple tongues. The desert breeds a kind of economy where risk is priced into the cost of things. Insurance, loosely interpreted, came in the form of shared convoy arrangements. If one wanted to travel with a dangerous load, one would pay for more guards or join a larger caravan whose sheer size was a defense. The pay of a caravan leader included not just coin but food, status, and sometimes marriage ties. Sponsoring a caravan was both an economic investment and a gamble on the caprice of weather and human intent. Banditry is as old as trade. Brigands knew how to set traps in passes and how to read the thinning out of guards as temptation. The steppe offered many hiding places, sheltered ravines, rock outcrops, and dunes that could cloak a small army. Lords equipped wildlife of law and hired riders to harass caravans when times were tough, turning politics into profit. Yet brigandage was not always a simple crime. Sometimes bandits were disenfranchised groups with their own laws and grievances against central powers. Caravanserais are the architecture of mercy in a harsh land. These roadside inns were more than sheltered spots. They were complex institutions with rooms for men and animals, storage for goods, and sometimes gardens that shaded weary travelers. Built at regular intervals, where geography allowed, the caravanserai offered a predictable pattern of rest along routes otherwise governed by chance. They became marketplaces in their own right, places where new routes crisscrossed old ones, and where the news of distant wars and distant marriages was exchanged like spices. The landscape changed the kinds of goods carried. In high mountain passes, pack animals were swapped for men who could navigate cairns and narrow ledges. In river valleys, boats and rafts took over, carrying heavier loads with less urgency but more risk from rapids. Deserts demanded lightness and endurance, courts demanded luxury and ornamentation. This geography shaped industries: silkworms along China's rivers, glass furnaces in Roman workshops, papermakers in Chang'an, and horse breeders on the steppes. Monsoon winds and seasonal rains mattered as much as the will of a ruler. In regions where monsoons were predictable, sailors charted courses that made maritime trade competitive with overland caravans. When the sea was reliable, goods moved more cheaply in bulk. But the desert offered routes inland where ships could never reach, carrying items that were too precious to be left to sea storms. Thus both paths, sea and sand, became parallel veins of the world economy. Religion traveled on the backs of beasts, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by incidental contact. Buddhism moved from India into East Asia along monastics who joined caravans for protection. Nestorian Christians maintained communities along the trade arteries, establishing churches where merchants felt the need for liturgy and mutual aid. Islam spread widely across the deserts as close traders and conquerors mingled, converting communities and founding new cities. Ideas converted as easily as coins, and like coins, they bore the marks of where they had circulated. Language itself was a caravan product. Words borrowed by merchants became permanent residents in other tongues. Persian terms filtered into Chinese administrative vocabulary. Chinese artisans adopted motifs from Roman glasswork. The Silk Road turned isolated languages into a mosaic of mutually intelligible terms and metaphors, where a single merchant might speak enough languages to barter, bargain, befriend, or betray. Trade was both the mother tongue and the nervous system of cross-cultural communication. Caravans carried stories like cargo. Tales of miracle wells that never ran dry, of star-guided compasses, of merchants who cheated death through prayer and cunning, were as valuable as a bale of silk. Storytellers traveled with caravans, their words lengthening cold nights and making strangers into a kind of family. The narratives had purpose. They were mnemonic devices for routes, coded wisdom for survival, and sometimes plain entertainment that stitched the human fabric of the trail. The Mongol expansion transformed the Silk Road in ways that were monumental and contradictory. On one hand, the Mongol Khanates imposed a kind of order, often called the Pax Mongolica, which reduced petty tolls and suppressed highway robbery for a time. On the other hand, the invasions brought violence and upheaval to cities and communities, shifting trade as some routes collapsed and others emerged. Under the Mongols, the speed of message delivery increased remarkably. Mounted couriers could convey news across vast distances with a speed previously unimaginable. Security and instability were twin companions of the route. When central authorities were strong, caravans enjoyed protection. When they fractured, new local powers rose to charge for passage. Tribute systems developed, and treaties sometimes made peace more profitable than war. A caravan's decision of route was often as political as it was practical. A prudent merchant knew the names of local governors and their habits as well as he knew the price of silk in distant markets. The desert imposes an austerity on material culture. Goods are precious not only for their value but for their portability. This meant that the most profitable items were light and had high value-to-weight ratios: silk, spices, precious stones, and dyes. But there were exceptions. Horses, for example, were central to military and social life and traveled along the road in large numbers despite their weight and appetite. Horses could make or break empires and were therefore a high-stakes commodity. The great cities that dotted the Silk Road became condensers of culture. Samarkand, Bokhara, Kashgar, and Dunhuang were more than stopping points. They were crucibles where art, religion, and law combined into distinct civilizational flavors. In their markets one could find carpets woven with Persian motifs, Chinese blue and white ceramics, and Turkic metalwork, all within a single bazaar. These cities attracted craftsmen who could learn techniques from far-off places and then inflect them with local taste. Caravan leaders were characters of many kinds. Some were pragmatic veterans who understood the land through calluses and scars. Others were merchants with cosmopolitan outlooks who preferred negotiation to violence. Trust within a caravan was a currency equal to gold. Contracts were often oral and enforced by reputation. The loss of trust could destroy a trader's livelihood overnight. This reliance on personal honor bred a legal culture of stories, oaths, and reciprocal obligations. The flow of knowledge followed the flow of goods. Paper, invented in China, traveled west along Silk Road routes and eventually revolutionized record-keeping and literature in the Islamic world and Europe. The spread of printing technology centuries later depended on these earlier exchanges, and with printing came a democratization of knowledge that reshaped societies. Gunpowder, too, visited the West via these networks, altering medieval warfare and the balance of power. Clothing and fashion are subtle measures of exchange. Dyes like indigo and madder, woven techniques, and garment cuts migrated and evolved. A style that began as elite attire could, over decades, filter down and re-emerge in altered forms in cities hundreds of miles away. Clothing became a visual map of connection, an embroidered pattern suggesting a storytelling motif from a distant court, a particular weave demonstrating technical knowledge passed across borders. Caravans adapted to hazards that modern travelers would barely imagine. Sandstorms could obliterate paths in hours and swallow entire camps if wind direction shifted. Heat stroke for men and beasts was a real threat, as was the creeping theft of water through evaporation and seepage. Some caravans traveled by night to avoid daytime heat, guided by the stars and by the memory of landmarks. The willingness to adapt to such hazards separated those who survived from those who became tragedies on the trail. The human body changed on the road. Muscle and gait adapted to long walks with loads. Skin tanned to a uniform leather color. Eyes developed a sensitivity to glare and to the long-distance gaze that summer savannas demand. Food habits shifted toward preserved goods, dried meat, barley, flatbreads, and, when possible, fresh fruits purchased at oases. The act of eating became ritualized. Never waste water on frivolous cooking, always save water for night. Music traveled too. The rubab and the dudur, the long-necked lutes of Central Asia, carried melodies that could be heard in tents and markets, weaving an emotional map of migration. Tunes traveled quickly, borrowed and transformed into local styles, becoming regional signatures. Music sustained the caravan's morale and was one of the clearest examples of how cultural expression moved as freely as goods and ideas. Markets at crossroads were theaters of information. A merchant could learn about the latest imperial edicts in Chang'an, the weather in Aden, and a bride's dowry practices in Isfahan, all within a single market day. Market room gossip was not trivial, it was economic intelligence, much like a modern trader's news feed. Those who controlled access to such flows wielded soft power, the ability to influence prices, to start rumors, and to change the trajectory of commerce. Religious syncretism is one of the Silk Road's lasting legacies. At many caravanserais, idols shared space with prayer rugs and statues of Buddha. Local customs blended, giving rise to unique forms of worship that incorporated elements from multiple traditions. This syncretism was practical as well as spiritual. Shared civic rituals could be essential for community cohesion in heterogeneous towns. The Silk Road also carried pathogens, and with microbes came pandemics that reshaped populations. The Black Death's movement across Eurasia is often linked to commercial networks that connected distant ports and inland trade routes. While commerce enabled civilization to flourish, it also tightened the web that allowed disease to spread rapidly. The consequences for societies were dramatic. Labor shortages, economic upheaval, and altered political landscapes followed in the wake of epidemics. The decline of the overland trade routes was as gradual as their rise. Maritime technology matured, ships grew larger and more reliable, and the opening of new sea routes undercut the profitability of some overland segments. Political changes, including the rise of powerful states that closed borders or imposed heavier tolls, made certain routes less viable. Yet decline was uneven. Inland routes continued to function, albeit on different terms, and new nodes rose to take advantage of shifting political and economic conditions. Women participated in ways both visible and invisible. In desert caravan life, women were often managers of logistics. They mended textiles, prepared food, trained animals, and sometimes even led caravans. In urban centers, women ran shops, engaged in money lending, and participated in craft guilds. The gendered history of the Silk Road is complex and regionally varied, challenging simple narratives about male-dominated trade. The material culture of the Silk Road survives in fragments, pottery shards, coins, inscriptions, and textiles that have resisted decay. Archaeology has shown us the lives behind the legends, and sometimes the mundane details tell the loudest stories. A child's toy found in a ruin, a storage jar cracked and mended, a ledger with faded ink documenting a 100-year-old debt. These artifacts humanize trade, turning merchants into people with families and obligations. The legal frameworks surrounding trade were diverse. In some places, contracts were formalized by local courts. In others, oral pledges backed by witness testimony sufficed. Merchants adapted to multiple legal systems, preserving their businesses by learning local customs as much as local laws. Trade law evolved as an exercise in flexibility. Traders negotiated exemptions, sought arbitration from neutral parties, and sometimes resorted to private enforcement when courts were absent. The Silk Road created a globalized palate centuries before modern globalization. Spices like cinnamon, pepper, and cloves reworked cuisines. Sugar traveled from the East. Citrus fruits changed diets in Europe and the Middle East. These items did more than refresh food. They reshaped social rituals and economic systems, as sugar, for instance, became not merely a luxury but a driver of colonial agricultural enterprises centuries later. Cartography evolved under the influence of caravans. Early maps were less about precise scale and more about functional knowledge, distance in terms of days, landmarks as navigation aids, and water sources as priority marks. Mapmakers listened to caravans for information about passes and hazards. Over time, as knowledge accumulated and cross-cultural exchange deepened, more sophisticated maps emerged that attempted to combine different cartographic traditions into something approaching modern geography. The role of hospitality cannot be overstated. In a place where water and shelter meant survival, the custom of offering shelter to travelers became institutionalized. Hospitality was governed by code as much as by decency. Desert cultures valued reputation, and a hospitable host enhanced his or her standing in a way that had direct economic repercussions. The reciprocal nature of hospitality, guests would repay in goods, labor, stories, or alliances, helped build networks of mutual dependency. Trade fostered technological exchange beyond mere objects. Metalworking techniques spread from one center to another, weaving patterns crossed borders and were adapted by local craftspeople. The transfer of astronomical knowledge improved navigation. Mathematical ideas moved from India through the Islamic world into Europe. Technologies were not just carried, they were taught and learned through apprenticeship networks that stretched from oasis to oasis. Silk production itself was a guarded secret for centuries. According to legend and some historical accounts, sericulture was tightly controlled by Chinese authorities who punished the export of silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds. Eventually, knowledge leaked through spies, exchange, or smuggling, and silk techniques replicated abroad. Once the secret was out, silk production proliferated, but Chinese silk remained highly prized for its quality and specialized methods. The psychology of caravan life forms a unique social experiment. People who lived together in the compressed conditions of a caravan developed systems of conflict resolution quickly. A quarrel could endanger everyone, so gossip and social pressure were effective tools of management. Structures such as communal eating, shared watch duties, and rotating leadership emerged to maintain cohesion, illustrating how necessity can foster innovation in governance at a micro scale. Ceramics and glass showed how taste could travel far faster than production centers. Roman glass made its way eastward and Asian motifs appeared in Western ceramics. The exchange was not one way. Artisans in various centers borrowed technologies and decorative styles, creating hybrid works that were neither wholly local nor wholly foreign. These objects reveal a commonality in aesthetic aspiration across cultures, a shared desire to beautify the mundane. Currency evolved under the constraints of mobility. Coinage helped standardize trade in certain eras, but barter remained common where coin supply was unreliable. Merchants often relied on bills of exchange and letters of credit that allowed them to move wealth without moving heavy bullion. This financial innovation anticipated modern banking by centuries and showed the capacity of merchants to invent institutions that matched the needs of long-distance trade. Networks of intelligence grew around the routes. Spies and informants were as much a part of the caravan's ecosystem as water carriers and cooks. News of a rebellion or the sudden reappearance of a toll could reach caravans before they reached a town, shifted by traders who specialized in information rather than goods. This early intelligence economy shows how knowledge was always a tradable asset on the Silk Road. The silk itself has a symbolism that exceeds its material value. In courts, it became a signifier of power and status. Emperors used silk as diplomatic gifts to secure loyalty and create political bonds. Its light and shimmering quality made it an ideal medium for creating ceremonial garments that marked office and prestige. In many ways, silk was the fabric of political theater as much as it was a commodity. The practicalities of packing goods are worth imagining. Merchants balanced fragile items like glassware against hardened goods like metalware, wrapping each layer in straw or fabric to prevent damage. The load on a camel's back was a lesson in physics and in priorities. Breakage meant ruin. Prudent traders developed packing systems that protected precious cargoes while maximizing volume and weight distribution. Religious institutions sometimes sponsored caravans for protection or for the spread of doctrine. Buddhist monasteries in Central Asia became centers of learning and sometimes economic activity, subsidizing travel and helping organize routes for pilgrims and merchants alike. Religious charity could be extended to travelers as a legal duty, creating a complex interaction between faith and logistics. Stories of individual merchants sometimes become legends. Take the figure of a trader who started with a handful of coins and died as a patron of a mosque or a library. These narratives demonstrate how trade generated new elites and shifted social hierarchies. Merchants often turned their wealth into social capital, funding public works, religious institutions, and schools, which in turn legitimized their place in society. The transformation from itinerant trader to local magnate is a recurring motif across centuries of Silk Road history. Medical knowledge transferred along the roads as well. Herbal remedies and surgical techniques were items of exchange, and physicians attached themselves to caravans or were summoned at towns along the way. A wound that might be fatal in isolated places could be treated with knowledge imported from far-off schools. Likewise, new diseases could appear in towns that had been untouched for generations. Health was a shared concern on the trail and a driver of itinerant professional practices. The environment itself was shaped by trade. Irrigation systems expanded around oases where profits from trade made investment worthwhile. Agricultural innovations traveled, crop rotation, grafting techniques, and irrigation engineering, improving yields and supporting larger urban populations. Yet the pressure of trade could also desiccate regions, as demand for certain crops led to monoculture and soil exhaustion. Education on the Silk Road was not confined to monasteries and madrasas. Apprenticeships and informal teaching took place in markets and workshops. A young person who worked in a caravan could learn not just how to wrap a bale but how to read people's faces, bargain, and know the worth of a rumor. This kind of practical education created a class of cosmopolitan artisans and traders who were literate in the ways of a connected world. Legal disputes had a human cost. When a caravan lost a load to bandits, or when words and promises were broken, restoration was rarely straightforward. Parties sought arbitration from neutral religious figures, local courts, or merchant councils. The outcome depended on evidence, reputation, and sometimes the relative strength of the litigants rather than the letter of any written law. Festivals stopped caravans in their tracks. Pilgrimage seasons and religious feasts redirected traffic and created profits for cities located along routes. Merchants timed their journeys to coincide with market fairs, where demand would spike and new buyers could be found. These temporal variations in trade reveal how commerce was not always a steady flow but a rhythm tied to the liturgical and agricultural calendars. The idea of ownership was flexible in caravan culture. Items might be left in communal storage, held under the watch of caravanserai managers, or pledged as collateral to other merchants. The social pressure to return borrowed items or repay debts worked alongside formal law to ensure compliance. These informal mechanisms often sufficed in places where formal institutions were weak or absent. The Silk Road's toll on nature was cumulative but uneven. Some stretches experienced soil salinization from irrigation, others saw deforestation as wood was harvested for fuel. Yet the trade also enabled conservation in some areas. Caravanserais became informal reserves where rare seeds and livestock breeds were preserved. Human economic activity has always altered environmental equilibriums, and the Silk Road is a podcast of those multiplied changes. The use of animals extended beyond transport. Dogs guarded camps, pigeons carried brief messages across short distances, and trained hawks were sometimes used for sport and hunting. Animals themselves were a kind of currency. Prized breeds fetched high prices, and knowledge of animal husbandry was a serious skill. The emotional bonds formed between humans and working animals are visible in tomb art and in the names given to favored camels and horses. Spices and perfumes were not merely gustatory pleasures but cultural technologies that altered daily life. People used fragrances to mask odors in crowded but poorly ventilated cities. Spices preserved food and allowed diets to be extended into lean seasons. The markets for these items created specialized trades and justified long and dangerous journeys so that the scent of a far-off land could impregnate local life. In art, the Silk Road created a montage of motifs. Buddhist paintings in Dunhuang show Hellenistic influence in drapery and posture, a testament to the layering of styles that occurs when cultures meet. Metalwork displayed hybrid forms combining Persian florals with Chinese iconography. The result was a cross-pollination that produced aesthetic forms that were neither wholly one thing nor another, but entirely new. Climate variation altered routes. Wet decades made some deserts livable for extended seasons, while prolonged aridity restricted the flow of caravans. Rivers shifted course over centuries, a once lively waterway could disappear and a city could decline as a direct consequence. Caravans adapted by shifting routes and relying on local intelligence to find the new life-giving sources of water. Fashionable commodities could spark political moves. The desire for Chinese silks and porcelain in the West and for Western horses in the East motivated diplomatic missions, thefts, and even wars. Trade preferences shaped foreign policy. Kings and emperors understood that controlling access to certain goods could give them leverage on the international stage. Thus, the Silk Road functioned not just as an economic network but as a stage for geopolitics. Architects responded to the needs of caravan cities by building fortifications, granaries, and public baths. The bathhouse was an important social institution, a place where merchants discussed business and where hygiene became a civic norm. Granaries stored surplus crops which could be taxed or sold during lean seasons, providing financial stability to urban centers. Public works like these were signs of the maturation of trade societies. Literature reflects the Silk Road's imagination. Travelogues, like those of later figures who wrote of their long journeys, became popular reading in certain circles, inspiring more exploration and feeding curiosity. Tales of marvels, strange animals, distant suns, exotic courts, fueled demand for travel and for things that could be acquired only by traveling. Literature functioned as a multiplier of desire, a cultural engine for commerce. The social structures of caravan towns were layered and complex. Guilds began to form, regulating quality and apprenticeship practices. Religious communities often administered charity, education, and basic social services. The interplay between merchants, religious leaders, and local rulers shaped a unique political ecology that allowed such towns to function amid uncertainty. The silk itself changed craft technologies. The demand for thinner, finer silk spurred innovations in loom technology and in sericulture. Dye techniques advanced to create more color-fast hues. As craft advanced, artisans demanded more capital to purchase finer raw materials, which in turn required more sophisticated financial instruments to support their trade. In times of war, caravans could be instrumentalized as supply lines or punished as economic targets. Armies sought to control trade to finance campaigns, to starve opponents, or to secure strategic locations. Conversely, during long peace, commerce became a stabilizing force that discouraged small-scale predation and encouraged investment in infrastructure. Education in caravan towns became more formalized with the rise of institutions that taught not just religious subjects but also arithmetic, languages, and law. This training produced individuals who understood accounting and contracts, skills that were immediately useful in trade. The professionalization of such knowledge contributed to the rise of a merchant class capable of complex financial maneuvers. Trade debts accumulated across borders, and repayment required networks of trust and enforcement. Default could be catastrophic, triggering cascading failures. Financial instruments such as letters of credit allowed wealth to move without the transport of heavy metals, but they also required enforcement mechanisms that stretched across cultures. Merchants developed mutual aid societies and associations that functioned as proto-banks and as early credit unions. The Silk Road supported not only elite consumption but also popular economies. Local craftspeople tailored their products to the tastes of passing merchants, creating goods that could travel but also that served local needs. Food stalls in caravan towns offered meals adapted to diverse palates, blending seasonings and techniques to suit an international clientele. These hybrid consumptions made caravan towns lively and cosmopolitan. The imprint of the Silk Road is visible in genetics, too. Populations along the routes show evidence of admixture, a biological echo of centuries of mixing. Genetic studies reveal migrations of peoples whose movements correspond to historical trade patterns. Culture was embedded in DNA, a biological footnote to the social and economic histories written in documents and on coins. Some caravan leaders became legendary for their cunning. Stories survive of those who tricked corrupt officials, rerouted caravans through safer passes by night, or hid their goods in clever disguises. These tales are instructive because they offer lessons in adaptability and in the moral illusions that survival sometimes necessitated. The road rewarded flexibility and punished rigidity. The Silk Road also gave rise to scandal and intrigue. Power struggles over lucrative trade routes led to assassinations, secret alliances, and hidden sponsorships. Merchants could be pawns in diplomatic maneuvers, their caravans used to smuggle messages or people. Such clandestine uses reveal how trade routes could be turned into instruments of statecraft and espionage. The language of bargaining on the Silk Road is an art. A merchant had to know the exact moment to show outrage, to feign boredom, or to offer a seemingly modest counteroffer. Such performances required psychological acumen as much as numerical skill. Bargaining could be a dance that concluded with a handshake and a shared meal, binding parties together in a ritual of reciprocity. Epidemiological lessons gleaned from historical Silk Road pandemics resonate with modern times. Patterns of spread, the role of travel networks, and the social response, quarantines, flight, have analogs now. Understanding how societies responded then gives us perspective on present crises, showing both the successes and the tragic missteps. Legends of vanished cities litter the margins of maps, settlements that thrived for a time and then were abandoned for lack of water or due to shifting trade. The ruins of these cities are haunting reminders of the fragility of human enterprise in face of environmental and political change. Archaeologists piece together daily life from shards and foundations, reconstructing a lost rhythm of lamps, treading feet, and traded goods. The Silk Road's influence extended into philosophy and theology. Debates about cosmology, metaphysics, and law traveled with merchants and thinkers, creating cross-pollinated schools of thought. The cosmopolitan atmosphere of cities allowed ideas to circulate and to be tested against different cultural assumptions. This intellectual exchange often preceded the political integration of regions, making shared frameworks possible. The economy of trust on the road was adjudicated by reputation. Records of who had honored promises were local gold. Contracts sometimes included clauses that required penalties in kind, exile, public shaming, or loss of trading privileges. The social costs of breaking trust were powerful deterrents in societies where reputation translated directly into earning potential. The artistry of silk and textiles reflected social hierarchies and religious affiliations. Certain colors or patterns were restricted to the nobility, other motifs signaled religious belief or local identity. Textile production thus functioned as a semiotic system whose messages were visible in public spaces. Garments were readable texts for those who knew the code. The material flow of the Silk Road contributed to changing dietary patterns. Wheat spread into regions where it had been uncommon, rice cultivation adapted based on population pressures and irrigation technology, and livestock breeds disseminated and mixed. The resulting changes in agriculture supported larger urban populations and more complex labor divisions. In the art of navigation, small signs were vital. Observing the way sand accumulated around a rock, a caravan leader could deduce wind patterns and probable storms. Tracks left by other travelers served as written testimony on the ground. This embodied knowledge of the terrain was often more reliable than any map and was taught through apprenticeship and storytelling. The Silk Road had seasons of boom and bust. Booms coincided with periods of political stability and technological improvements. Busts followed wars, plague, or climate downturns. Entrepreneurs adapted by diversifying goods and routes, sometimes pivoting to regional trade when long-distance sales became unprofitable. Economic resilience was a matter of strategy and luck. Religious pilgrims were a constant presence, their journeys often overlapping with commercial traffic. Pilgrimages generated demand for services and goods along routes and sometimes reoriented trade priorities. Holy sites became nodes of cultural exchange where germs, ideas, and goods all mixed under the aegis of devotion. The decline in the use of Chinese silk in some courts did not mean the end of silk's cultural power. Instead, silk was adapted, revalued, and refashioned as local industries grew. Local elites could demonstrate cosmopolitan credentials by participating in silk economies even as production became more distributed. This evolutionary aspect of material culture shows how commodities can metamorphose within changing political landscapes. The social stratification of caravan towns was sometimes surprisingly fluid. A successful merchant could buy nobility, a skilled craftsman could acquire land, and a caravan leader could become a political asset to a local ruler. At the same time, entrenched elites could limit upward mobility through taxation and law. This tension shaped the social dynamics of trade centers. The Silk Road nurtured the idea of the world as connected. Cartographers and thinkers began to conceive of a continuous human geography stretching from one ocean to another. That awareness slowly transformed how rulers thought about policy, diplomacy, and warfare. The mental model of a connected world preceded and perhaps made inevitable the more formal global networks of later centuries. In the twilight of the road's prominence, romantic images persisted, of caravans silhouetted against dunes, of merchants counting coins beneath lantern light, of children chasing camels in oasis markets. These images kept the memory of the road alive in literature and folklore. Modern explorers and scholars have sought to reconstruct this past not as a single narrative but as a kaleidoscope of human experiences. Modern infrastructure sometimes traces the bones of ancient routes. Highways, railways, and airline corridors often follow paths that made sense centuries ago, hugging passes and valleys that minimized resistance. In doing so, they create continuity with the Silk Road's flow, a reminder that geography exerts a persistent pull on human movement. The roads we build today echo the caravans of the past. Revival projects and cultural initiatives have sought to recapture the connective spirit of the Silk Road. Museums, festivals, and collaborative archaeological projects celebrate the region's shared heritage. Yet revival is complex. It raises questions about heritage, ownership, and the use of memory for political ends. The modern Silk Road is as much an idea as it is a policy-making tool. The Silk Road stories continue to inspire because they are about human ingenuity in the face of constraint. Whether through the stubborn wisdom of a caravan leader who reads the desert like a book or through the meticulous craft of a weaver who dyes thread with rare pigments, these narratives celebrate adaptation. They remind us that exchange is more than commerce, it is the ongoing negotiation of meaning between strangers who become neighbors. Many small details of caravan life deserve attention because they illuminate daily rhythms. The way bread was kneaded in the morning, the exact method of tethering a camel to prevent it from wandering at night, the way a trader's ledger was arranged, each habit tells us about priorities and constraints. These domestic practices reveal how culture is made of tiny, quotidian choices that, together, sustain long projects. The Silk Road was a theater of human contradiction. It offered possibility and peril in equal measure. It enabled fabulous wealth but also exposed entire societies to risk. It carried art and science and disease. To study it is to accept complexity. Trade fosters both cooperation and conflict, innovation and exploitation. The end of the old overland systems was not a simple death but transformation. As sea routes rose, as political maps were redrawn, and as economies shifted toward new centers, the old networks atrophied or evolved. Yet the cultural flows they initiated continued through other channels. Languages, cuisines, musical motifs, and religious practices retain traces of millennia of contact. If you listen to the land where caravans once crossed, you hear a different silence now, rail lines humming, highways slicing through, but also the faint echo of old chants and the rustle of a textile that still remembers the hands that wove it. The physical Silk Road is layered in time. Its present is a palimpsest of tracks, ruins, and renewed activity. In that layered silence, human continuity is audible. History teaches that trade networks are living organisms. They flourish when nourished by political stability, by technological innovation, and by the continual exchange of ideas. They falter under the weight of isolation, climate stress, and political fragmentation. The Silk Road's lessons remind us to value the fragile infrastructures that undergird exchange. The desert teaches a kind of moral patience. Caravans that learned to respect its rules found ways to thrive. Those who tried to dominate it were ground by its indifference. The same principle applies to cultural exchange. Mutual respect and humility produce long-term connections. Arrogance produces short-lived triumphs. The Silk Road leaves us with stories worth retelling. The trader who turned coins into a library, the caravan leader who navigated a storm by remembering a child's song about stars, the artisan who mixed foreign dyes and created a new color. All these stories are small embodiments of a grand human project. They attest to the capacity of human beings to make beauty and meaning out of movement. To think of the Silk Road as merely an economic corridor is to misunderstand it. It was a living web of relationships, an engine of culture, a conduit of power, and a theater where human drama unfolded day after day. Caravans and deserts were the hardware. People, with their compassion, craftiness, courage, and contradictions, were the software. Together they produced a historical continuity that still affects us today. Imagine a ribbon of paths unspooling across deserts, mountains, and plains, a lifeline braided from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. The Silk Road was not a single road but a living network of routes, inns, markets, and sea lanes that stitched distant worlds together. From the first footsteps of merchants and envoys, it became a place where empires met, traded, and sometimes collided, each encounter leaving traces on language, law, faith, and art. To understand these collisions, we start with the terrain itself. The steppes of Central Asia were at once barrier and bridge, offering fast-moving routes for mounted nomads and long stretches where water and grass, not traffic, determined the flow. Mountains like the Pamirs and the Tian Shan forced travelers into narrow passes that could be controlled by rulers or raiders, creating choke points where diplomacy and force mattered as much as the quality of a caravan's pack animals. The silk that gives the routes their name first drew imperial attention from China. Silk was woven deep in Chinese workshops, prized for its luster and lightness, and jealously guarded as a state secret for generations. Yet silk left Chinese looms and traveled westward in traders' bundles, becoming a symbol of status in Rome and a currency of cultural exchange as much as a product of commerce. The story bends back to the Han Dynasty and the figure of Zhang Qian, an envoy dispatched in the 2nd century BCE to scout alliances and routes beyond China's borders. Zhang's return reports of Fergana horses, of grapevines and jade, and of a world of kingdoms that lay between China and the Mediterranean. His tales turned into imperial policy, and the Han state invested in garrison towns, diplomacy, and the protection of merchants who would become the arteries of the Silk Road. While Han envoys looked west, another set of players held sway over the middle stretches, the nomads and city-dwelling peoples of Central Asia. The Saka, the Sogdians, the Kushans, and the Huns, among others, molded the routes to their advantage. The Sogdians in particular became master middlemen, their language and mercantile networks seeding communities from Xi'an to Constantinople and shaping both commerce and the cultural grammar of the trade. Across the western terminus, the Roman world responded to silk and spices with fascination and a growing appetite. Roman merchants sought luxury goods that conferred prestige and power, and the Roman state engaged in diplomacy and intermittent conflict with Eastern actors over access to these prized commodities. Roman coins, glassware, and metalwork found their way eastward, while Eastern luxuries gilded the lives of Roman citizens and the palaces of emperors. But the Silk Road was never a straight exchange between China and Rome. It was a chain of hands and hands-off rulers, and each link could alter the flow. Parthian and later Sasanian Persia sat like a gatekeeper between the two empires, skillfully taxing, absorbing, and sometimes intercepting luxury traffic. Their cities on the fringes of the Iranian plateau became centers of manufacture and exchange, where Eastern goods could be repackaged and sold to Western buyers. When we say empires collided, we mean it literally and figuratively. Armies met on these routes, and so did ideas. Faiths traveled alongside fabrics. Buddhism, born in the Ganges Plain, moved north and east along merchant tracks into Central Asia before finding patronage in China. Monks, art, and scriptures traveled with caravans, and along the way they absorbed local artistic styles, creating the hybrid visual world known as Gandhara, where Greek and Indian forms blended in stone and stucco. The Hellenistic kingdoms left their imprint long before Rome's full embrace of Eastern trade. After Alexander's campaigns, Greek-ruled Bactria became a cultural island where Hellenistic motifs mingled with Iranian and Indian elements. Cities like Ai-Khanum became hubs of blended architecture and learning, and their descendants would act as cultural partners for both eastward and westward movement, transmitting Greek science and art along routes that would later carry Buddhist monks and silk merchants alike. In these borderlands, crafts traveled as readily as ideas. Glassware made in the Mediterranean reached Chinese tables, while Chinese silks found favor in Rome. But even more transformative were technologies that moved quietly and altered societies. Papermaking from China, once a clerical craft, eventually reshaped record-keeping across Eurasia. The arrival of writing materials and the techniques to produce them changed how empires administered far-flung territories and how merchants kept ledgers across thousands of miles. The caravan cities themselves deserve attention. Places like Samarkand, Bokhara, Kashgar, and Dunhuang were not mere pit stops. They were crucibles of exchange where languages, cuisines, and religions braided together. A traveler in Samarkand might hear Sogdian traders arguing prices while Persian poets recited verses and artisans knead pigments for ceramics that would be carried westward. In those marketplaces, empires met face to face, governors enforcing taxes, priests preaching competing creeds, and ambassadors arranging marriages or alliances. These cities often rose under imperial patronage, and their fortunes rose and fell with the tides of empire. The Kushan Empire, straddling northern India and Central Asia, provided a crucial corridor in the early centuries of the Common Era. Kushan rulers embraced multiculturalism as policy, minting coins with Greek letters and Buddhist imagery, and their control of mountain passes encouraged safe passage for merchants and monks traveling into China and the Mediterranean. Religions are among the most visible evidence of the Silk Road's syncretic nature. Buddhism's westward journey carried it through Gandhara, where monks adopted Hellenistic iconography that made the Buddha's image familiar to Greeks and Central Asians. Nestorian Christianity arrived in China and adopted local terms to explain its theology. Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism spread eastward, adapting to new surroundings, while Islam, arriving from the Arabian Peninsula centuries later, became a major connecting tissue for traders across wide stretches of the route. Language and script also migrated, often accompanying merchants. Sogdian became a lingua franca of caravan trade, its script carved on stones and written in ledgers and letters. Later, Arabic script spread with Islam, and Persian became the diplomatic and literary language in many courts stretching from Anatolia to India. Each language left imprints, loanwords, bureaucratic terms, new poetic forms, revealing the intimate, daily collisions of worlds that the Silk Road made inevitable. Material culture tells a similar story. The Greco-Buddhist sculptures of Gandhara depict robed Buddhas with Hellenistic facial features, Syrian glass shards have been found in tombs in China, and Roman coins were discovered in burial mounds in Mongolia. Objects did not merely travel, they were absorbed into local ritual and style, reinterpreted, and sometimes repurposed. A Roman lamp might become part of a Central Asian shrine, and Chinese motifs might be worked into Persian ceramic glazes. Statecraft adapted to this interconnectivity. Empires learned to use diplomacy and the projection of force along trade corridors. The Han built garrisons and fortified cities to protect commerce. The Romans entered into treaties and recognized buffer states like Parthia to limit direct conflict. Sasanian Persia developed a sophisticated system of fortresses and elite cavalry designed to dominate key passes and routes. Control of a single oasis city could secure revenue from caravans for decades. At the same time, empires often preferred to strike partnerships rather than permanent occupations. Marriages, gift exchange, and envoys created ties that were as important as soldiers on the ground. Emperor to emperor, these gestures signaled recognition and negotiated space for merchants. A silk robe or a magnificent horse could seal an alliance as effectively as a garrison, and the exchange of luxury goods often doubled as diplomacy writ small. The seaborne routes formed a parallel world. The maritime Silk Road linked ports from the Persian Gulf through the Indian Ocean to Southeast Asia and southern China. Arabian dhows and Chinese junks carried spices, pearls, ceramics, and textiles, and their captains navigated monsoons with knowledge that rivaled any map. Ports like Malacca, Calicut, Hormuz, and Guangzhou became cosmopolitan centers of encounter where sailors and merchants from many tongues mingled. Because both land and sea routes fed into the same markets, goods could take complex circuits across the world. A spice from the Malabar coast might travel by ship to Arabia, then overland to Persia, and finally be traded westward into the Mediterranean. Conversely, glassware from Venice could find its way into the hands of Chinese nobles through successive trades. This interdependence meant that disruptions in one region, war, drought, or plague, could ripple across continents. Powerful empires sometimes sought to monopolize these flows, and the economic stakes were huge. Control over maritime choke points like the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca meant levying duties or dictating commerce. Likewise, controlling a mountain pass or oasis could offer the same leverage over land-borne caravans. The competition to secure these strategic nodes was a form of low-level warfare that shaped imperial priorities for centuries. The arrival of Islam in the 7th century transformed many of these dynamics. Islamic caliphates built networks of governance and law that facilitated trade across previously fragmented territories. Arabic became a common script for commerce, and Muslim merchants linked markets from North Africa to Southeast Asia. At the same time, the intellectual life of these empires absorbed and translated Greek, Persian, and Indian scientific works, creating a shared corpus of knowledge that would later travel westward into Europe. The Tang dynasty in China, ruling from the 7th to the 10th centuries, nurtured a cosmopolitan order in which foreign merchants planted quarters in cities and foreign religions found institutional recognition. Chang'an, the Tang capital, was a bustling metropolis whose markets sold spices, gems, and foreign foods, and whose streets echoed with languages from Central Asia and beyond. The Tang court's openness to foreign arts and ideas amplified the Silk Road's cultural output, making China a central node in a global exchange of style, religion, and technology. Yet openness came with risks. The very connectedness that made Silk Road cities prosperous also made them vulnerable to disease, espionage, and political infiltration. Envoys and merchants carried more than goods. They carried information and, sometimes, pathogens. Epidemics followed trade routes with grim efficiency, reminding rulers that the benefits of exchange were matched by costs that could undermine their societies. One of the most dramatic transformations of the Silk Road era occurred with the Mongol conquests in the 13th century. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, a vast empire stretched from the Pacific to the Danube, and for the first time in centuries a single political authority could claim dominion over much of the overland route. The Mongols enforced a law and order often called the Pax Mongolica, which reduced tolls and banditry, opened postal stations, and encouraged merchants to travel with greater security. The Pax Mongolica did not eliminate violence, but it reshaped the scale of exchange. Caravans moved faster and with more confidence, and emissaries traversed enormous distances with letters backed by imperial authority. The Mongols were curious patrons of artisans and scholars, and their rule facilitated unprecedented intellectual exchange. Persian administrators helped run parts of China, Chinese engineers contributed to Western campaigns, and European travelers like Marco Polo journeyed to courts where East and West literally met at the same table. Yet the Mongol era also reveals the darker side of intercontinental contact. The same routes that allowed the exchange of manuscripts and luxury goods also permitted the transmission of the Black Death in the mid-14th century. Scholars debate exact pathways, but plague spread along caravan and naval routes, ravaging populations in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe in waves. The demographic shock reshaped economies and societies, weakening some empires and transforming labor relations across vast regions. The Black Death's consequences were not uniform, but its impact on commerce was profound. Demand for luxury goods sometimes collapsed while other sectors adapted. Labor shortages prompted technological change and shifts in power from landed elites to more mobile commercial classes. In many ways, epidemic crises underscored the inherent fragility of systems that linked far-flung peoples and showed how empires could be altered by flows of disease as much as by flows of gold. In the wake of the plague, new political formations arose and old ones mutated. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia and the consolidation of power in China under the Ming dynasty changed how the Silk Road functioned. The Ottomans controlled key overland bridges between Asia and Europe, and their growing power, combined with greater naval capabilities in Europe, gradually shifted the axis of trade toward maritime routes and away from traditional overland caravans. European maritime expansion in the 15th and 16th centuries, propelled by navigational advances and an appetite for direct access to spices and luxury goods, began to siphon off trade from the Silk Road. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and later British and French seafarers established oceanic circuits that connected Europe to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The overland Silk Road did not disappear, but it declined in relative importance as oceanic capacities made distant goods more accessible through alternate channels. Nevertheless, the overland routes endured, changing their character. Local and regional trade flourished even as global patterns shifted. Caravan routes continued to supply inland markets with staples and luxuries, and the pattern of cultural exchange persisted in new forms. The Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, and Qing empires each managed pieces of the old network, occasionally revitalizing nodes of exchange and sometimes contesting one another for control over profitable corridors. The collision of empires along these routes took many shapes. Sometimes it was war over territory, other times it was the soft power of cultural prestige. Imperial courts competed for artisans and adopted foreign fashions to signal cosmopolitan legitimacy. The exchange of palatial styles, tiled domes, patterned carpets, lacquered screens, made architectural and decorative vocabularies that traveled with craftsmen and designs across continents. Diplomacy often had a theatrical quality, and court gifts played a central role in international relations. An ambassador might arrive laden with silken mirrors, and the spectacle of exchange could smooth a treaty as effectively as a formal text. These rituals reinforced hierarchies while acknowledging interdependence, and the wording of treaties often reflected the pragmatic recognition that commerce required cooperation, even between rivals. Trade networks also created new social classes and shifted power dynamics at local levels. Merchant guilds and broker families accrued influence disproportionate to their numbers, mediating between imperial demands and market realities. Banking practices evolved to accommodate long-distance risk, and letters of credit and bills circulated, precursors to modern financial instruments. Such developments helped sustain commerce across eras of political instability. Cultural exchange fostered artistic innovation. The decorative arts along the Silk Road incorporated motifs from many traditions, producing ceramics, textiles, and metalwork that cannot be pinned to a single culture. The transfer of glazing techniques and kilns, for example, led to the flowering of ceramics in places like Iran and China, each absorbing foreign methods and making them distinct. Likewise, musical instruments and performance styles moved with itinerant artists, creating hybrid repertoires appreciated by diverse audiences. Languages continued to adapt to the traffic. New vocabularies appeared for commodities and measurements, and diplomatic phrases crossed borders. Trade required trust, and that trust was built on shared language and law as much as on reputation. The evolution of commercial lexicons across the region is testimony to centuries of daily encounter where bargaining, credit, and contract mattered. Religion and philosophy did not travel alone either. They were often accompanied by patronage and institutional networks. Monasteries became stops for travelers, centers of learning, and sometimes producers of manuscripts that preserved knowledge across generations. Islamic madrasas, Buddhist monasteries, and Christian communities each played roles in education and the transmission of knowledge, lending moral frameworks to cosmopolitan societies and legitimizing rulers who supported them. Medical knowledge flowed along these routes as well. Herbal remedies, surgical techniques, and theoretical approaches to healing crossed cultural boundaries, enriching local traditions. Persian physicians translated and expanded Greek medical texts, which later fed into Arabic medical traditions, some of which were subsequently translated into Latin and entered European medical practice. The exchange of practical as well as theoretical knowledge underlined the Silk Road's role in global intellectual history. Technology made the link between distant peoples tangible in everyday life. The spread of papermaking and printing from China to the Islamic world and then to Europe revolutionized the dissemination of information. Gunpowder, invented in China, moved westward and altered military tactics. The compass, adapting to maritime needs, enabled sailors to traverse oceans with greater confidence. Each invention had unintended consequences that reshaped empires and their capacity for projection. Commerce also left marks in legal and administrative forms. Contracts, mercantile law, and tax systems adapted to the realities of long-distance trade. Empires developed protocols for tolls, caravan rights, and dispute resolution mechanisms. These frameworks made trade predictable and accountable, encouraging investment in merchant ventures despite the risks of travel. The Silk Road was an incubator for identity as well as exchange. People who lived and worked along the routes often had hybrid identities, speaking multiple languages and adhering to mixed cultural practices. Caravanserai hosts, translators, loan brokers, and local governors cultivated cosmopolitan outlooks out of necessity, knitting together communities that were as much products of the road as the cities they served. Gender roles along the routes could be complex. While much of the historical record focuses on male merchants and extant male written sources, women played significant roles as traders, artisans, and household managers. In some oasis towns, women managed markets or engaged in silk production. In port cities, women from different cultural backgrounds participated in commerce as brokers or proprietors. The social fabric that sustained the Silk Road relied on the often underacknowledged labor of women across regions. Food and cuisine adapted to the movement of ingredients and culinary ideas. Rice and soy traveled east and west in various forms, while spices from South Asia and Southeast Asia tinted diets in the Mediterranean. The culinary fusion within Silk Road cities produced dishes and foodways that carried cultural memory: pilaf spiced with cinnamon and cardamom, noodles flavored by fermented sauces. Lively proof that exchange altered daily life as much as grand policy. Art and iconography served as visual witnesses to hybridity. Textile patterns incorporated Persian motifs, Chinese dyes met Central Asian looms, and tapestries displayed scenes that combined mythic motifs from different cultures. Artistic synthesis was not merely decorative, it represented ways of thinking about the world where multiple narratives could coexist on a single object. As empires grew and contracted, the flow of people on the routes included forced movements. Slavery and captive labor formed part of the Silk Road economy, and enslaved people were traded for goods or served in households and armies. This human dimension of commerce reminds us that prosperity often had a bitter underside, and that the routes made possible the mobility of both skill and suffering. The environmental impacts of long-distance trade are visible too. Caravan traffic altered grazing patterns and water use around oases, while deforestation occurred near cities that demanded timber for shipbuilding and construction. Animal diseases and pests sometimes moved with livestock, changing agricultural practices. Those effects show that economic exchange recast landscapes as surely as it reshaped politics and culture. Over time, new powers recalibrated the map. The rise of centralized states in China under the Ming and later the Qing changed policies toward foreign trade, sometimes restricting contacts and sometimes cultivating selective engagement. Those policy shifts altered the flows of goods and peoples, demonstrating how imperial rule could bend but not wholly stop the siren call of long-distance commerce. Colonial encounters in the early modern period further redefined the Silk Road's legacy. European empires shaped maritime routes and extracted wealth from colonies, creating new economic priorities. Yet they also encountered older networks and had to navigate established patterns of exchange. Colonial projects often superimposed new political borders over ancient routes, sometimes disrupting local economies and sometimes integrating them into global systems driven by different imperatives. The 19th century introduced new technologies that again transformed connectivity. Steamships and telegraphs compressed time and space, allowing information and goods to move with unprecedented speed. Railroads later cut across Eurasia, rerouting trade, and imperial powers fought for control of these new arteries. The traditional Silk Road networks adapted, declined, or sometimes morphed into modern transportation and communication corridors. Archaeology has added layers to our understanding, unearthing textiles, manuscripts, and artifacts that tell intimate stories about people who traversed these routes. The Mogao caves near Dunhuang revealed a repository of documents and art that chronicle centuries of exchange. The letters of traders and the records of monasteries give texture to the quotidian aspects of long-distance trade. These finds show that the Silk Road was a human story as much as an imperial strategy. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, nationalism reconfigured how societies along the Silk Road saw themselves. New states sought to assert borders that had rarely mattered to itinerant merchants and pastoralists. The imposition of modern cartography and bureaucratic controls sometimes severed traditional flows and created marginalized communities suddenly trapped between state lines and changing economies. The 20th century's revolutions and wars further disrupted ancient connections. The collapse of empires, the rise of Soviet control in Central Asia, and the upheavals of China and the Middle East altered the networks that had functioned for centuries. Borders hardened, and some caravan routes fell into disuse, while others adapted to the new political realities or survived as cultural memories of a different era of connectivity. Yet the idea of the Silk Road retained power. Scholars, travelers, and political leaders invoked it as a metaphor for exchange and collaboration. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, renewed interest in Eurasian connectivity took political and economic forms, with projects aiming to rebuild infrastructure and revive trade corridors. This modern rhetoric often blended historical romance with contemporary strategic goals, showing how the Silk Road continues to be a canvas on which new empires and alliances paint their ambitions. Looking back, we see how the Silk Road was an engine of globalization long before the modern era, a space where empires met, mingled, competed, and collaborated. The collisions of empires along these routes produced currents of continuity and change, shaping technologies, beliefs, and artistic expressions. Those interactions transformed the lives of rulers and farmers, monks and merchants, artisans and slaves, creating an interwoven legacy that still shapes the modern world. Today, the Silk Road lives in material remains, in place names, and in the shared customs of peoples who once stood at crossroads of empire. Festivals celebrate blended traditions, languages maintain loanwords, and craft traditions reveal patterns of cross-cultural borrowing. The physical routes have been layered over by highways and railways, yet the stories embedded in them persist in the archives, the ruins, and the living cultures that trace their histories along those paths. The lasting lesson of this history is that contact between distant societies yields both opportunity and risk. Empires that understood the productive power of exchange cultivated arts and sciences, and sometimes peace. Those that sought closed monopolies often turned commerce into conflict. The Silk Road shows that openness to foreign influence could invigorate societies, while fear and closure could stunt them, a dynamic as relevant now as it was 2 millennia ago. As you listen, imagine the faces of people who met where empires touched, a Persian merchant bargaining for silk in a Kashgar bazaar, a Chinese monk copying a sutra in a cave illuminated by a foreign oil lamp, a Roman noble wearing silk robes at a formal banquet. Each of those encounters represents a collision of empires and of ordinary lives, where the global and the local braided together into durable human narratives. In the end, the Silk Road was less about a highway paved with stone and more about an ecology of interaction. It was an evolving matrix of places and practices that allowed ideas and goods to move, that created fortunes and fostered knowledge, and that spread both beauty and devastation. The face-to-face meetings at its crossroads made world history, showing that when empires meet, the outcomes are never simple but always transformative. And so the story continues in our own era, where the movement of goods and people is faster but the human stakes remain unchanged. New projects propose to bind continents closer still, and the history of the Silk Road offers both caution and inspiration. It tells us that connectivity can be a source of creativity and prosperity, but also that it requires careful governance and a willingness to share the benefits of exchange across societies. To listen to the history of the Silk Road is to hear centuries of footsteps, the clink of coins, the murmur of many languages, and the turning of pages in manuscript rooms. It is to witness empires collide not only in battle but in curiosity and commerce, and to recognize that those collisions made the modern world possible. The ancient routes remind us that the meeting of East and West was never a single moment but an enduring process, one that continues to shape our shared future. Long before maps suggested neat lines and nation-states, a web of tracks and currents stitched together continents, carrying not only silk but 1,000 desires. In that network, spices glowed like coins and secrets moved like shadows, both traded for promises, marriages, and the fortunes of empires. The roads were not a single ribbon but a braided system of land paths, riverways, and sea lanes that followed wind and season. To understand the price of the most coveted trade, we must listen to the sounds of camel bells, the hush of caravanserais, and the hush of whispered deals in dim rooms. At the heart of the story lies the spice itself, pepper that stung the tongue and preserved meat, cinnamon that perfumed courts, cloves and nutmeg that became more valuable than gold in some years. Spices were prized as medicine, as status, and as currency of taste, rearranging diets and rituals across continents. They carried with them stories of distant landscapes, steaming rainforests, volcanic islands, and highland plantations, and the people who tended those lands. The demand shaped voyages, wars, treaties, and the lives of ordinary men and women who harvested and ground those fragrant treasures. Origins of the routes are ancient and gradual, not invented in a moment but emerging out of trade between neighboring valleys and cities. Traders from the Chinese empires pushed westward with silk and ceramics, while Central Asian nomads moved eastward with horses and hides, and South Asian merchants threaded the tropical goods to the north. The earliest exchanges were local and seasonal, but as empires expanded and roads improved, distant goods began to appear in markets far from their sources. Each object carried a chain of hands, languages, and fees, becoming more desired and more costly with every mile. Geography shaped everything. Deserts like the Taklamakan and the Karakum were barriers that funneled caravans along narrow ribbons of survival, where water and shelter determined life and death. High mountain passes in the Pamirs and the Himalaya tested oxen and resolve, and mountain valleys became chambers of culture where artisans, monks, and merchants paused to replenish. Rivers like the Amu Darya and the Indus carried goods to ports where ships could take them to faraway shores. The sea routes, hugging coasts and relying on monsoon winds, offered alternatives that grew in importance when overland travel became more dangerous or expensive. Caravans were mobile societies, equal parts commerce and theater. A typical group crossed deserts in a long file of camels, each hump and pack assigned like a role in a play, with a mix of drivers, guards, artisans, and often families. Caravanserais, great roadside inns, provided safe havens, spaces for negotiation, exchange of news, and rumors that shaped political decisions. Along the way, languages mingled, and deals were struck not only with coin but with credit, promises, and social obligations, the trust of the caravan mattered as much as the weight of the cargo. The routes were also a conveyor for secrets, religious ideas, technological innovations, and espionage as easily as spices. Buddhism spread from India into Central and East Asia along merchant routes, sitting comfortably with travelers who offered alms and sought protection. Manuscripts, paper, and printing technology moved along these lines, as did the knowledge of gunpowder, the compass, and new ship designs. Some knowledge was carefully guarded, its value tied to military or economic advantage. Other knowledge flowed freely, changing the world in ways never intended by any single trader. Imperial ambitions and military campaigns repeatedly remade the map of commerce. When empires rose, they often invested in roads, posts, and protections that made trade safer and more predictable. The Pax Romana in the West, and later the Pax Mongolica, created windows of relative safety that allowed merchants to move with reduced fear of banditry and tribute. But peace was fragile, and when conflicts returned, so did taxes, tolls, and closed passes, forcing merchants to invent new routes or pay higher costs. The ebb and flow of power turned the price of spices into a political lever. The city-states and port towns along the trade lines were crucibles of culture and power. Cities like Samarkand and Kashgar thrummed with workshops and markets where languages overlapped and goods were tested and repackaged. Coastal ports such as Calicut, Aden, and Malacca were where oceanic weather met the appetites of inland markets and where powerful local rulers could make fortunes taxing ships. These nodes were more than exchange points. They were information hubs where travelers left news of famines, coronations, and wars that would alter the direction of trade. One vital trade good was black pepper, a climbing vine native to the western Ghats of India. Pepper could be transported dried, retaining its pungency and commanding high prices in northern markets where its flavor was exotic. Roman and Byzantine elites sprinkled pepper over meat and used it in medicines, making it a status good as much as a seasoning. As demand rose, merchants created networks to get pepper to Mediterranean markets, passing it through many hands and paying tolls and taxes that multiplied its price before it reached the plates of the rich. Cinnamon came from trees grown in tropical forests and was coveted not only for taste but for ritual and medicine. Europeans knew cinnamon as something almost mystical, a spice of kings and temples. Because of its rarity, traders wrapped cinnamon in myths about gardens and guarded islands, stories that enhanced its allure and made traders cautious to protect the market value by controlling information. These myths were part advertisement and part survival strategy, and they show how perception could be as valuable as supply. The Malay archipelago, the so-called Spice Islands, held cloves, nutmeg, and mace, each with unique flavors and coveted properties. Nutmeg, in particular, commanded insane prices in certain eras because its islands were few and its cultivation controlled. European powers obsessed over direct access to these islands, and their rivalry pushed out older overland routes as sailors pursued new sea lanes. The resulting wars and colonization in the archipelago would devastate local populations and ecosystems in pursuit of monopoly profits. Trade required more than goods, it needed finance and trust. Early forms of credit emerged to fund long voyages and caravans, with deposit and lending arrangements that foreshadowed modern banking. Bills of exchange allowed merchants to avoid carrying large amounts of coin through dangerous territories, while checks, letters, and guarantors formed a lattice of trust. These financial instruments lowered the transaction costs of trade but also introduced new vulnerabilities to fraud and political interference when states imposed controls. The price of spices reflected not only supply but risk and monopoly. A merchant might buy pepper at a coastal bazaar for a modest amount and then endure months of travel, paying bribes, tariffs, and rent for protection that doubled or tripled the cost. In times of conflict, The same goods could multiply in price as merchants took longer routes or hid their cargoes. Monopolies, sometimes enforced by states, sometimes by mercantile guilds, artificially restricted supply to keep prices high, an exercise that often provoked violence when the stakes were enormous. Warfare frequently intersected with trade. Control of ports and passes was a strategic imperative that could fund entire empires through customs and taxes. The Crusades, for instance, had trade consequences that redirected goods and opened new contacts between East and West, while also exposing Europe to new technologies and foods. The Mongol conquests in the 13th century, brutal as they were, established overland security that allowed an unprecedented movement of people and goods. Yet every rearrangement of power created winners and losers in the trade chain, and the social costs could be profound. Venetian and Genoese merchants in the Mediterranean became the great middlemen between Europe and the East, shaping European tastes and politics with the goods they distributed. Their ships, their credit networks, and their intelligence networks made them indispensable to European princes eager for spices and silks. Venetian influence extended not just through trade but into diplomacy and warfare, as states paid for their services or competed with their access. Their dominance made spice trade a matter of statecraft and helped make the Mediterranean rim a center of economic gravity for centuries. The arrival of new navigational knowledge and the desire to bypass middlemen pushed European explorers to seek sea routes around Africa and across the Atlantic. Portuguese mariners, aided by improved caravels and understanding of the monsoon winds, established a route to India that undermined overland trade monopolies. The first Portuguese fleets reached Calicut and returned laden with spices, signaling a shift in the global balance of trade. The sea route reduced the number of hand spices passed through, changing prices in Europe and sending ripples through the economies of land-based empires. The Portuguese succeeded through a mix of naval skill and ruthless policy, establishing fortified trading posts and demanding privileged access to spice-producing regions. They often used force or coercion to control choke points and protect their convoys, initiating a new era of maritime empires. Their actions provoked resistance, forming alliances between local rulers and other European powers, and set the stage for long-term colonial competition. Spices were the prize, but control of the sea lanes became the instrument of empire. As the Portuguese influence spread, so did new kinds of violence and administration in distant lands. European powers introduced plantation systems, slave labor, and extractive policies designed to guarantee a steady supply of desired goods at lower costs. The human consequences were immense. Traditional farming communities were restructured, local elites were displaced or co-opted, and entire ecosystems were altered to favor lucrative species. The commodity's price could ignore these social costs, but the consequences would shape centuries of inequality and resistance. The Dutch and the English later entered the fray with corporations that blurred the line between private enterprise and sovereign power. The Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company obtained charters that allowed them to wage war, make treaties, and govern colonies in the name of profit. They created corporate militaries to seize spice-producing islands, establishing monopolies with brutal efficiency. Their competition culminated in striking episodes like the Dutch conquest of the Banda Islands to control nutmeg, where violence and forced labor decimated local populations. Supply manipulation became a deliberate economic policy. The VOC in particular pursued strategies of supply control, destroying clove trees outside their territories and enforcing harsh regulations on cultivation and trade. These measures kept prices high in European markets but wreaked havoc on local autonomy and biodiversity. Under this system, spices were not simply commodities, they were instruments of power, reshaped by empires to serve imperial needs. For local communities, the cost was immediate and existential. Land was repurposed, labor coerced, and entire cultures transformed to meet European appetites. Piracy and privateering were constant factors on the sea routes, making maritime trade risky despite the protections of convoy and gunboat diplomacy. Pirates lurked in straits and archipelagos, attacking lightly armed merchant ships and enriching local chieftains or foreign investors. Privateers, working under letters of marque, blurred legality by attacking enemy commerce in wartime and contributing to the overall cost of security. These maritime threats raised insurance costs and forced merchants to either arm their ships or surrender cargo to naval powers in exchange for safe passage. Beyond economics, spices had a profound effect on culture and cuisine. The European palate was transformed by the imports, introducing new flavors into diets and courtly tables. Spices entered religious rituals and medicines, incorporated into healing recipes and preservatives that changed food safety and longevity. The taste for these exotic flavors also encouraged experimentation in cooking and dining practices, influencing social rituals from banquets to daily meals in diverse cultures across the globe. The Silk Road was also a conduit of biological exchange, not only of plants and spices but of epidemics and new crops. Diseases traveled along with goods and people, sometimes wreaking havoc on populations with little immunity. Conversely, the exchange of crops and farming techniques, from citrus fruits to sugarcane and rice varieties, altered agriculture and diets in profound ways. These biological movements changed landscapes of health and food security, sometimes with dramatic demographic and political consequences. Espionage was an intrinsic part of the trade because information about supply, demand, and routes could be as valuable as cargo itself. Rulers and merchants alike hired agents to gather intelligence about rival fleets, crop yields, and alliances. Spies supplied secrets on production locations and shipping schedules, enabling blockades or surprise raids. Knowledge moved in hidden compartments, and letters disguised as poems, and by word of mouth across crowded bazaars. Religious caravans and holy men often traveled alongside traders, creating a unique intermingling of spiritual and material exchange. Monastic centers supported by merchants became repositories of knowledge, translating texts and preserving philosophies. The spread of Islam, for instance, was closely tied to trade networks, and Muslim merchants played central roles in linking markets from East Asia to West Africa. Religious ideas and rituals adapted as they moved, sometimes syncretizing with local practices and sometimes provoking conflict when new beliefs challenged old orders. Legal frameworks grew around commerce, with custom codes, contracts, and merchant law designed to reduce friction in an uncertain world. Local rulers established systems to adjudicate disputes and levy taxes, while merchant guilds enforced codes of conduct among their members. These rules reduced transaction costs and encouraged long-distance trade by giving parties recourse in case of theft or fraud. Over time, the institutionalization of commerce created a predictable environment in which high-value goods could circulate more freely. Technological transfer was a hallmark of the network. Navigation instruments like the compass crossed from Chinese workshops into Middle Eastern and European hands, changing the possibilities of sea travel. Papermaking and printing spread, fueling the storage and dissemination of knowledge that merchants used for accounting and statecraft. Gunpowder, initially a curiosity, transformed military affairs and, by extension, protected and threatened trade routes depending on which parties mastered it. The Mongol era deserves particular attention because it reshaped the cost and scale of trade in a dramatic way. The Mongol Empire carved a contiguous space across Eurasia and enforced a degree of security that allowed merchants to traverse vast distances with less fear of robbery. This Pax Mongolica facilitated the movement of luxury goods, returning previously dormant routes to life and enabling unprecedented flows of information and science. Yet the Mongol conquests also displaced populations and disrupted agriculture, reminding us that the short-term benefits of safer trade coexisted with long-term social upheaval. Marco Polo's travels symbolized another dimension of the spice and silk trade, the human story of wonder, ambition, and translation. His accounts brought tales of palaces, spices, and strange customs to an eager European audience, fueling imaginations and desire for direct access to Eastern luxuries. While his narratives sometimes blurred observation and hearsay, they crystallized the idea that distant wealth could be reached, and they spurred monarchs and merchants to pursue new routes. The cost of that pursuit, however, would be counted in blood and displacement across continents. The Ottoman Empire came to dominate key choke points between East and West, particularly after the fall of Constantinople. Ottoman control of land routes and Aegean sea lanes allowed them to collect tolls and influence the flow of goods to Europe. European access to spices became entangled with diplomacy and warfare. The Ottomans wielded tariffs and control over intermediaries as tools of statecraft. This geopolitical barrier was a major incentive for Europeans to find sea routes to Asia, ultimately undermining the overland dominance of the Silk Road system. Trafficking in knowledge included not only navigation and commerce but also medical and culinary secrets. Herbalists carried recipes and compounds across languages, and medical texts circulated along merchant routes, blending practices from China, India, Persia, and Europe. Spices often entered pharmacopoeias as active ingredients in remedies for fever or digestion, and they were valued for antiseptic and preservative properties. Such medical uses magnified demand because spices promised not only flavor but health and longevity. Trade imbalances were a perpetual concern. Europe, hungry for spices and silks, often had less in immediate demand by producers, prompting Europeans to export silver and later manufactured goods to balance trade. The outflow of precious metals sometimes led to inflation and economic stress, and it spurred Europeans to rethink how to control supply chains more directly. These economic pressures were central to the age of exploration and the later mercantilist policies that defined European imperial expansion. Environmental consequences followed the quest for profit. Introduction of intensive agriculture for commercial crops altered watersheds and local ecologies, sometimes leading to soil depletion and famine. The demand for spices encouraged monocultures that made local economies vulnerable to pestilence or market collapse. In some cases, fisheries and forest resources were overexploited to support the colonial economies, showing that the price of trade extended into the health of landscapes that had sustained human communities for generations. Cultural exchange reshaped art, language, and fashion. Fabrics and dyes moved with spices, and motifs crossed boundaries, transforming local styles into hybrid expressions. Words for spices entered languages, and culinary techniques traveled as cooks migrated with merchants, reimagining local cuisines. This exchange created a tapestry of linked identities, where a dish in one city could contain flavors shaped by 1,000 miles of interaction and negotiation. Resistance was as constant as commerce. Local rulers, religious leaders, and common people pushed back against the disruptions that spice trade brought. Rebellions erupted when monopolies forced dispossession or when forced labor policies were imposed by colonial powers. These resistances took many forms, from armed revolt to subtle noncompliance, and they sometimes succeeded in protecting local autonomy or rights over resources. Trade script included not only profit but confrontation, negotiation, and the struggle for dignity. The Atlantic turn changed the calculus irreversibly for many regions. As European powers built empires in the Americas and established plantations that produced sugar, tobacco, and other cash crops, the center of gravity in global trade shifted. The Silk Road's overland arteries declined in relative importance as oceanic flows grew in scale and profitability. Even so, the inland routes remained active, adapting to new demands and new rulers, but they never regained their previous centrality in the global economy. Commodity prices reacted to supply shocks and to the vagaries of politics. Years of famine, war, or disease in producing regions could cause spikes in European markets that enriched some merchants and ruined consumers. Conversely, crops could be increased by deliberate effort, reducing prices but sometimes also devaluing the labor of producers. The volatility of prices made lives precarious along the entire chain, as fortunes could be made and destroyed by a single seasonal failure or a war that closed a pass. The interplay of secrecy and publicity underpinned trade strategies. Traders protected routes and recipes while also advertising their wares to generate demand. Some states attempted to standardize or reveal information to attract merchants, creating directories and maps, while merchants preferred to keep sources secret to preserve advantage. This dynamic produced a layered economy of knowledge in which some things were widely known and others jealously guarded, giving rise to mysteries that heightened the spice's allure. Banking and credit matured as contact intensified. Long-distance trade required instruments like promissory notes and forward contracts that let merchants hedge risks and plan campaigns. In cities, money changers and lenders grew sophisticated in arbitrage and currency exchange, smoothing transactions across regions with different coinages and value systems. These financial innovations lowered barriers to entry for some but also allowed powerful houses to dominate trade networks through capital and influence. Patterns of labor shaped production at the origin points of spices. Smallholder farmers, enslaved laborers, indentured servants, and free peasants each played roles in harvesting and processing spices depending on region and era. The organization of labor could be family-based and traditional, or newly coerced and commodified under colonial regimes. How communities arranged labor determined not only productivity but also social resilience and the ability to adapt to market fluctuations. Religion and ritual often sanctified the trade in spice and silk. Offerings of incense and sweet-smelling spices accompanied ceremonies, and spices were used in rites of passage from birth to death. This sacred role elevated certain spices beyond mere commodities, embedding them in cosmologies and daily life. When traders disrupted access to these materials, local communities experienced more than an economic loss; they endured a spiritual and cultural deprivation. The narrative of exploration is also a narrative of failure and myth. Many voyages returned empty-handed, and countless caravan journeys ended in desert graves. Yet stories of success were amplified and mythologized, encouraging more attempts and more risk-taking. These myths powered a cycle of investment and conflict, as states backed voyages with tax money and merchants pressed for profit despite the toll measured in human lives and ruined communities. Scientific curiosity sometimes rode along with merchant caravans. Naturalists, physicians, and botanists accompanied traders or were supported by them to collect specimens and knowledge. The trade stimulated empirical observation and classification as Europeans and Asians sought to understand and exploit new species for medicine, dye, or flavor. This exchange enlarged the global catalog of nature but also led to appropriation and sometimes to the extinction of species exploited for profit. Legal pluralism characterized many trading zones, with overlapping jurisdictions of local rulers, merchants, and imperial powers. Contracts or disputes might invoke customary law, religious law, or edicts from distant sovereigns depending on the participants. This legal diversity created flexibility but also complexity, sometimes enabling arbitrage where merchants exploited loopholes to evade taxes or regulation. The friction of legal pluralism was part of the cost structure of trade, affecting where merchants chose to settle or route their goods. The silk that gave the road its romantic name often moved alongside spices, and together they represented luxury and cultural aspiration. Silk functioned as a visual marker of wealth and was woven into rituals and politics. Control of silk production and distribution was a strategic asset for regimes seeking to display power and to profit from demand among elites. The interdependence of silk and spice illustrates how different luxury goods reinforced each other's market dynamics across the network. Collective memory preserved the drama of the routes in songs and stories. Caravanserai gossip, sailors' chants, and court poets kept alive the narratives of distant lands and their scents. These cultural memories shaped identity and provided continuity for communities that depended on long-range exchange. Memory turned trade into a lived heritage rather than a series of transactions, investing the routes with human meaning that outlived any single empire. The legal frameworks of modern states eventually standardized many aspects of trade, including tariffs, maritime law, and customs. As nation-states consolidated, they sought direct control over trade to fund growing bureaucracies and standing armies. This process transformed mercantile competition into national competition, and the pursuit of spice and silk became one element in broader strategies for power and wealth. The state's role in trade emphasized scale and bureaucracy but also introduced a new kind of risk, that of national policy turning a market into a battlefield. The age of steam and the opening of the Suez Canal further compressed distances, altering the economics of transporting high-value goods. The canal made sea lanes shorter and cheaper, further reducing reliance on traditional overland routes. Industrialization changed demand patterns too, as manufactured goods became a central export from Europe and as refrigeration and preservation technologies reshaped what could profitably be traded. These technical shifts diminished the monopoly value of spices by making them more accessible and less rare. In modern times, the legacy of the Silk Road remains visible in cuisines, languages, and genetic traces of migrations. Contemporary trade routes replicate old flows and open new ones, but the human stories of exchange, of ambition, cooperation, and coercion persist. Spices no longer command fortunes in the way they once did for elites, but their cultural significance endures in recipes, rituals, and markets from Guangzhou to Granada. The route's history shows how material desire and human ingenuity created a world that was more connected and more contested than any single polity could foresee. The ethics of the spice trade's history are complex and uncomfortable. For every merchant who profited legitimately, there were others who enriched themselves through violence, deception, or exploitation of labor. Colonial regimes imposed patterns of extraction that devastated local societies and environmental systems, and those legacies are still being reconciled in many regions. Reckoning with this past requires acknowledgement of the suffering as well as the creativity that built global connections. Yet the story also contains examples of collaboration and resilience. Local communities adapted crops and techniques, merchants formed networks of mutual aid, and ideas traveled that improved irrigation, medicine, and scholarship. In marketplaces, people of different faiths and languages negotiated coexistence and created shared norms that eased commerce. These cooperative moments remind us that commerce can foster cosmopolitanism even amid inequality and conflict. Museums and archives preserve many artifacts of the trade, porcelain fragments, ship logs, and market lists that allow historians to piece together the route's daily life. Archaeology at caravanserai sites reveals layers of occupation, repair, and reuse, showing how merchants carved permanence out of ephemeral journeys. Texts from travelers, merchants, and chroniclers supply color and detail, though always filtered through perspective and bias. Together, These sources help reconstruct the texture of past economies and provide a mirror for our contemporary global exchanges. Before concluding our survey, it is worth pausing on the human scale once more. The farmer in the spice groves, the woman grinding pepper at a market stall, the child who watched caravans pass through town. Their lives were structured by seasons and prices, kinship obligations, and imperial edicts, and their endurance was the true infrastructure of trade. They sustained networks that shaped empires, and their stories deserve as much attention as the ships and palaces that appear in histories of conquest and commerce. In the modern economy, many of the old trading patterns have been institutionalized into global supply chains, but the logic of desire and monopoly still applies. Corporations and states still jockey for control over commodities, and the environmental and social costs of extraction continue to be externalized in many cases. The history of the Silk Road warns that the benefits of trade are rarely evenly distributed and that the quest for profit can produce both brilliant cultural fusion and profound injustice. Finally, the Silk Road's history teaches that connectivity is neither purely good nor purely bad. It is a human project of exchange with consequences that depend on how power is wielded and how communities respond. Spices and silks catalyzed technologies, religions, and cuisines, but they also provoked wars, exploitation, and environmental change. If we listen to this history, we hear both the lures of profit and the echoes of those who paid the price, and we are reminded that the true cost of the most coveted trade was paid long before the goods arrived on grand tables. Even as modern logistics and globalization have made many spices commonplace, their stories continue to matter. Each packet sold in a supermarket carries echoes of ancient pathways and of choices that shaped cultures and climates. When we taste pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg, we taste a condensed history of movement and meaning, a legacy of a world knitted together by appetite and courage but shadowed by conflict and greed. To understand the complete history of the Silk Road is to recognize the delicate balance between the enrichment that exchange offers and the human and ecological costs it so often incurs. This narrative stretches across millennia and continents, and in its folds we find recurring themes: ambition, adaptation, secrecy, and resilience. Empires rose and fell around these flows, technology spread alongside small sacks of herbs, and ordinary people negotiated survival amidst imperial demands. The long arc of trade left behind cities, cuisines, and conflicts that still shape our world, showing how deeply the simple act of trading a spice can reverberate. Looking at the Silk Road through the lens of spices and secrets reveals the lengths societies will go to obtain what they desire. The roads embody human ingenuity in the face of geography and politics. New routes were carved, ships were built, and laws were invented to secure flows of goods. But they also tell a tale of exclusion, where monopolies and violence were tools to preserve value, often at great cost. The balance between innovation and corruption is a persistent theme across the ages. The maritime turn led to colonial empires that reoriented local economies toward global markets, creating dependencies that persisted after formal colonial rule ended. Post-colonial states grappled with these legacies while seeking autonomy over their resources, and international institutions rarely resolved the deep inequalities that had been established. The story of spices is thus inseparable from the broader history of modern imperialism and the continuing struggles over economic sovereignty and justice. In recent years, renewed interest in the Silk Road has inspired projects to revive overland connectivity, both as cultural heritage and as contemporary trade corridors. Governments and entrepreneurs speak of new rail links and trade corridors, aiming to harness the symbolic and practical benefits of connectivity. These modern initiatives echo historical patterns, promising growth but also raising concerns about ecological impact, debt dependency, and cultural disruption. Once again, the debate returns to the question of who benefits when routes are remade. Culinary historians remind us that taste is a living archive of trade. Regional dishes that seem local often contain imported elements that transformed cooking traditions. The adoption of spices into local cuisines was not passive. Cooks integrated new flavors into staples, inventing hybrid dishes that are now signature foods of entire nations. In this way, the Silk Road's legacy continues to nourish identities and to remind us that culture is an ongoing dialogue of influence and invention. Museum displays and academic studies continue to parse the archaeological and textual evidence, refining our understanding of trade dynamics. Each discovery of a shard of pottery or an old accounting ledger can shift our view of who traded with whom and how goods and ideas circulated. Scholars debate the extent to which the Silk Road was a single coherent system or a patchwork of overlapping routes, and those debates reveal as much about modern methodologies as about the past itself. The ecology of spice production also yields lessons about sustainability and monoculture. Long-term dependence on narrow cash crops can impoverish soils and communities, and the historical record shows cycles of boom and bust. Modern agricultural policy increasingly acknowledges the need for biodiversity and local food security rather than exclusive reliance on global markets, but translating that insight into practice remains a challenge. The environmental costs of past spice economies offer cautionary tales for contemporary resource management. Language travel is a less tangible but powerful legacy. Loanwords for spices, cooking techniques, and trade instruments crisscross languages across continents, testifying to long contact. Such linguistic footprints reveal the human relations behind commerce, interpreters, translators, and intermediaries who made transactions possible. When we trace words in different languages, we unearth networks of human contact as surely as when we trace coins or cargo manifests. The Silk Road's history is also a story of resilience in the face of climate and disaster. Droughts and floods forced traders to reroute or to store goods for lean years, and communities developed complex systems of water management and storage. The capacity to adapt to environmental shocks often determined whether a city flourished or faded, reminding us that trade was and remains contingent on nature's rhythms. Today, as climate change intensifies, these historical experiences can offer both warnings and inspirations for resilience. Art and material culture were profoundly influenced by exchange. Textiles, metalwork, and ceramics show hybrid motifs that cross traditional stylistic boundaries, and motifs once native to one region appear in artifacts found thousands of kilometers away. Patronage of art by wealthy merchants and rulers spread aesthetic forms across zones of contact, producing objects that are both local and global. These artifacts are physical evidence of a world in which ideas and goods travel together. The security structures that protected trade also created power bases that could outlast empires. Caravansary owners, guild leaders, and port authorities accumulated wealth and influence that sometimes translated into political power. Their ability to enforce rules and to provide services made them indispensable, and at times they leveraged that position to negotiate autonomy or privilege with powerful rulers. The institutional memory of these organizations shaped regional governance long after individual empires had vanished. In tracing the full sweep of the Silk Road, we must not forget the small intimacies that made the trade human: the bargaining over a bundle of cinnamon, the pause for a prayer at dawn, the repairing of a frayed rope by a child's nimble hands. These small acts kept goods moving and businesses afloat and remind us that networks are built of innumerable small interventions. It is in these details that the grand narrative of cross-continental exchange takes on its true human scale. Modern historians are increasingly attentive to voices previously marginalized in accounts of global trade: women traders, enslaved laborers, and local artisans whose labor made luxury possible. New archival methods and interdisciplinary studies aim to recover these perspectives to create a fuller and more just history. Recognizing these voices changes our understanding of cost, revealing not just economic metrics but human experiences of exploitation and agency alike. Finally, the spice-driven history of the Silk Road invites reflection on how we value things. Do we measure price solely in currency and measure cost solely in labor and land, or do we include cultural loss and ecological degradation in our accounting? This is not simply a historical question but a contemporary moral one as we continue to consume globally sourced goods. The choices we make about production and consumption carry forward lessons from the Silk Road era and challenge us to seek trade that is ethical, sustainable, and equitable. The Silk Road, then, is not merely the tale of caravans and spices but a mirror reflecting how humans connect, compete, and create meaning. Its pathways carried luxury and poverty, enlightenment and devastation, culinary pleasure and cultural transformation. To follow its story is to confront the complexity of globalization before the modern age and to see how taste and secrecy can alter the course of history. The long shadow of those roads still reaches us when we open a spice jar, read a foreign proverb, or cross borders that were once trade lines. As listeners travel through this story, whether literally on a road or metaphorically through time, the contours of the trade reveal themselves in layers: economic, social, political, and environmental. Each layer adds richness but also weight, reminding us that the simplest pleasures often have hidden costs. In the end, the narrative of spices, secrets, and wars teaches humility, that every item on a table has a backstory entwined with human hope and hardship, and that knowledge of that backstory can transform how we taste and how we act. Long before the word globalization became common, long before steamships and fiber optic cables, a braided network of trails and sea lanes stitched continents together. People called it the Silk Road, a convenient name that masks complexity, but the roads themselves were neither single nor continuous. There were multiple routes bending around mountains and deserts, crossing seas, and linking markets, ideas, and lives across vast distances. The story begins not with silk alone, but with movement. Silk, that shimmering fabric from China, was one of many commodities that set wheels in motion, but so were horses, spices, pearls, glass, and the simple human hunger for what lay beyond the next horizon. Traders, pilgrims, soldiers, and migrants followed paths worn by rivers and beasts of burden, establishing stopovers and settlements that would grow into cities famed for learning, craft, and hospitality. Geography shaped the Silk Road as much as human desire. The great highlands and deserts of Central Asia funneled traffic into narrow corridors where water could be found and camels could rest. Mountain passes became strategic guardians, and oases turned into bustling bazaars, because in those stretches between scarcity and plenty people had to trust one another, barter their wares, and exchange news about weather, politics, and bandits. Along these routes, caravans moved like slow, deliberate organisms. Camels, chosen for their endurance, bore bolts of cloth and crates of tea, while horses carried riders and swift messages. The caravan pace allowed conversations to ripple across months, so that a rumor, a prayer, or a recipe could travel farther than a single human life, seeding new habits and hybrid arts in distant towns. Cities along the road thrived as centers of exchange and culture. Chang'an, later Xi'an, served as a gateway in the east, while Samarkand and Bukhara stood like medallions in the middle, and Antioch and Constantinople connected to the Mediterranean world. These cities were not merely trading posts, they were places where languages met, where craftsmen learned new techniques, and where scholars compared texts and calendars. Trade brought more than goods. It brought ideas that altered how people understood the world. Buddhism left India for China across these routes, finding new forms of practice and new patrons as it traveled. So too did Christianity and later Islam, each religion adapting to local customs and participating in the exchange of philosophical and legal thought. Monasteries and temples often played a role that surprised modern eyes. In the cold caves near Dunhuang, monks copied and preserved texts, creating a library that would later reveal the multiple voices that used the road. These religious communities offered shelter and learning, and their archives show how scripture, poetry, and science circulated together, sometimes wrapped in the same bundle as a merchant's ledger. Language itself was a living thing on the road. Sogdian merchants, for example, spoke a tongue that served as a lingua franca for many years, while scripts and alphabets flowed with scribes and clerks. New idioms and loanwords crept into local speech, creating patchwork dialects that testified to centuries of contact and shared commerce. Money had to adapt to the needs of long-distance trade. Where coinage was impractical, merchants used credit, bills, and receipts that anticipated modern letters of credit. These financial instruments required trust and networks of agents, which in turn encouraged the growth of banking practices and contractual norms across regions that had once been economically insular. The caravanserai was an architectural response to this need for trust and shelter. These roadside inns provided a place for men, beasts, and bundles to rest and be inspected. Within their walls deals were struck, news was exchanged, and new religious and culinary habits were tested and adopted. The Silk Road also moved technology. Glassblowing, papermaking, and ceramic techniques spread in different directions, each innovation transformed where it arrived. Paper, originating in China and reaching the Islamic world and Europe, altered how knowledge could be recorded and transmitted, revolutionizing administration and scholarship. Food and plants traveled too, changing diets and farming across continents. Asian crops and fruits made their way westward, while Central Asian grains and Western vegetables found new soils to flourish in. The movement of spices and sugar shifted tastes and economies, and it shaped social rituals around dining and medicine. Medicine itself was a hybrid practice along the road. Physicians exchanged herbs, surgical techniques, and medical texts, blending Greek, Indian, Persian, and Chinese traditions into evolving systems of care. This cross-pollination did not homogenize practices, it enriched them, producing local schools of healing that drew on a surprising range of influences. Art and aesthetics were equally mobile. Textile patterns, ceramic glazes, and metalwork techniques crossed borders, becoming locally crafted but internationally inspired. A motif carved in a Central Asian workshop might later appear in a temple in Kashmir or a palace in Anatolia, a visual testimony to travelers who moved not to conquer but to create. Not all exchanges were peaceful or consensual. The Silk Road could be a vector for violence as well as trade. Armies used these routes to project power, and sometimes conquerors seized control of lucrative segments to fund their campaigns. Yet even in the shadow of conflict, the road's networks proved resilient, resuming commerce when the guns fell silent. One of the starkest examples of unintended consequences was the spread of disease. The close contact among people and animals enabled pathogens to travel farther than before. Plague swept across continents with caravan speed, reshaping demographics and economies in ways that historians still study for their lessons on vulnerability and resilience. When the Mongols rose in the 13th century, they left a paradoxical imprint on the Silk Road. Their conquests brought destruction, yet under certain Khans the empire created an unprecedented period of connectivity and security. The Pax Mongolica fostered safer travel for merchants and scholars, and this facilitation allowed for an extraordinary exchange of ideas, inventions, and commodities. Mongol patronage also encouraged the movement of artisans and administrators across regions. Craftsmen were relocated, printing blocks moved, and engineers were tasked to build infrastructure that supported both war and trade. The empire's reach linked East and West in practical ways, helping to seed innovations and administrative practices across Eurasia. Europe's encounter with the Silk Road is a story of fascination and ambition. Venetian traders and explorers like Marco Polo returned with tales of riches and new governance ideas, fueling imaginations and policy back home. Those tales would later be overheard by merchants and monarchs searching for faster routes and greater profits, setting in motion maritime voyages that altered the traffic of the road. The rise of seafaring trade gradually shifted the balance of goods and routes. Ships offered faster and often cheaper ways to move bulk cargoes, and European powers invested heavily in naval technology and colonial outposts. Yet the overland Silk Road did not vanish overnight. Its inland routes adapted, specializing and continuing to link places that maritime routes could not reach. Ports became the new gateways that joined sea and land networks. Places like Guangzhou in the east and Alexandria in the west served as nodes where ships met caravans and where cultures mingled. Maritime traders brought their own cosmopolitanism, which layered atop the richness of inland exchanges and produced new hybrid cultures across coastlines and islands. The Ottoman Empire's control of strategic land routes in the later medieval period added another twist. By managing passage through Anatolia and around the eastern Mediterranean, successive Ottoman policies affected European access to eastern goods. This interdependence between land and sea, and between empires and merchants, shaped the geopolitics that ultimately directed trade toward the oceans. By the early modern period, the Silk Road had become both a historical memory and a living set of lanes. Some segments continued to hum with market life, others dwindled into local paths. The distinction between the romantic Silk Road imagined in salons and the pragmatic routes used by peasants and traders reminded observers that history contains many layered truths. Archaeology began to fill in details that travelers' tales had left vague. Excavations of caravan towns revealed storage rooms, stamped ceramics, and coins from distant realms, while desert libraries like the discovery at Dunhuang unveiled manuscripts that documented the daily life and cosmopolitanism of the road. These finds complicated romantic myths, showing both the routine and the extraordinary. Silk itself remained a symbol even as its monopoly ended. The fabric's luster inspired poets and painters, and it became shorthand for luxury and interconnectedness. Workshops across Asia and Europe adopted sericulture or imitated silk's sheen with local techniques, spreading the desire and the material culture associated with elegance. The role of women in Silk Road societies has often been overlooked, but closer study reveals their presence in trade, craft, and religious life. Women sometimes managed markets, wove textiles, or served as healers and couriers. Their agency varied with local customs but was real and consequential. Family networks also underpinned commercial trust, as marriages could forge alliances across ethnic and political divides. Ethnic diversity was a hallmark of Silk Road towns. Persians, Turks, Chinese, Indians, Arabs, Tibetans, and many others lived in close quarters, negotiating identities as well as transactions. This complexity produced hybrid art forms, syncretic religious practices, and social arrangements that anachronistic national narratives sometimes struggle to reflect. Language and script adapted to this diversity through multilingual inscriptions and bilingual documentation. Merchants used multiple writing systems, often hiring scribes versed in more than one tongue. Over time, this multilingualism supported complex contracts, diplomatic correspondence, and literary exchanges that enriched local cultures. Trade also shaped legal and diplomatic practices. Agreements about liability, weights, measures, and caravan security required standards and enforcement. Diplomatic missions negotiated safe passage, tolls, and jurisdiction, creating a proto-international framework that allowed far-flung merchants to operate with some predictability. The environment reacted to the traffic as well. Irrigation projects near oases expanded agriculture to feed caravans, while overgrazing in some regions stressed the land. The Silk Road's human imprint can still be read in terraces, canot systems, and abandoned settlements that mark the line where commerce once demanded new landscapes. Artistic exchange along the Silk Road produced some of the most striking visual hybrids in history. Greco-Buddhist sculptures carved in Gandhara show Hellenistic drapery on figures of the Buddha, while Central Asian textiles preserve motifs that travel from the steppe into Persian palaces. These works testify to a creative friction where artists borrowed freely to forge new expressions. Music, too, moved like a portable architecture of sound. Instruments and scales traveled with performers, resulting in music that borrowed rhythms and modes across regions. The soundscape of Silk Road towns would have been polyphonic, with languages and melodies overlapping in marketplaces and courts. The Silk Road also served as a laboratory for scientific exchange. Astronomical tables, mathematical ideas, and medical knowledge crossed cultural boundaries, often translated and adapted into new frameworks. Scholars in Baghdad, for example, synthesized Greek, Persian, and Indian works, creating texts that later reached Europe and informed the Renaissance. Maps and geographic knowledge expanded because of the road. Travelers and geographers compiled new information, noting rivers, deserts, and mountain passes, which helped future pilgrims and merchants. These evolving maps were not just practical tools, they represented changing perceptions of the world and the road's place within it. Stories about the Silk Road infused literature and popular imagination. Tales of merchants who became princes, or of saints whose relics traveled in secret, populated the narrative landscape. These stories functioned as moral guides, entertainment, and repositories of cultural memory, sometimes preserving kernels of historical truth in their folds. Empires that rose and fell along the route left enduring marks. The Abbasid Caliphate fostered Baghdad as a center of learning and trade, while the Tang dynasty promoted Chang'an as a cosmopolitan capital. Later dynasties, from the Seljuks to the Timurids, each added layers of architecture, law, and commerce that the road absorbed into its long story. The arrival of Europeans to Asian markets shifted dynamics once again. Merchants from Venice and Lisbon negotiated with Ottoman and Persian authorities, creating new financial flows and political tensions. These interactions accelerated the redirection of trade toward the sea but also introduced European ideas and goods into inland markets. In the modern era, the Silk Road became a symbol as much as a network. Travelers in the 19th and early 20th centuries romanticized caravans and ancient ruins, while archaeologists and scholars recovered artifacts for museums. This reimagining sometimes eclipsed local memories, but it also brought attention to the material heritage that connected so many peoples. During the 20th century, changing borders and national narratives reshaped the memory of the Silk Road. New states in Central Asia and the Middle East curated the past to fit modern identities, sometimes highlighting certain sites and stories while neglecting others. Yet the underlying connections persisted through migration, trade, and shared cultural practices. In recent years, nations and institutions have sought to preserve Silk Road heritage while also promoting tourism and economic projects. Archaeological conservation and UNESCO designations helped protect caves and monuments, but development pressures raised questions about whose history is prioritized and how to balance preservation with local needs. The road's heritage belongs to many, and decisions about its future require careful negotiation. Modern infrastructure projects invoke the Silk Road name to describe new ambitions. Rail lines, highways, and pipelines echo the old corridors, promising faster flows of goods and ideas. These projects often carry geopolitical weight, as states seek both economic integration and strategic influence, which complicates historical analogies between past connectivity and present policy. The Belt and Road Initiative has revived debate about the road's legacy in contemporary politics. Some see it as a continuation of ancient exchange principles adapted to today's world, while others warn about debt, sovereignty, and uneven benefits. The comparison is apt in its imagery but imperfect in its reality, because modern projects operate under different scales of capital, law, and power. Digital Silk Roads now exist in the transmission of data, streaming services, and e-commerce platforms that link producers and consumers across continents. In some ways, these virtual networks echo caravan routes by connecting suppliers and markets, but they also introduce new forms of surveillance, intellectual property debates, and cultural homogenization risks. The same questions of access and equity that merchants faced centuries ago reappear in digital garb. Preservationists wrestle with what to save and how. Should a desert site be left undisturbed, or should it be carefully excavated to reveal daily life? Should local communities benefit from tourism that brings in outsiders, or does it erode the authenticity that travelers crave? The answers are rarely simple, and each decision traces the same tension between past and present that the road itself embodies. Contemporary artists and writers continue to draw inspiration from Silk Road themes, producing works that cross media and borders. Photographers document the fading faces of caravan towns, composers blend traditional motifs with electronic textures, and novelists imagine characters who travel with motives both familiar and straining against time. These creative acts keep the road alive in the cultural imagination. The Silk Road's most enduring legacy may be less material than relational. It taught societies how to manage difference, how to bargain with strangers, and how to live with the uncertainties of long-distance connections. Trust networks, multilingualism, and the habit of borrowing techniques and ideas became part of a shared toolbox that supported complex societies across Eurasia. Looking back, it's tempting to pick one episode to symbolize the Silk Road: a caravan making its way over a pass, a scholar translating a text by lamplight, a potter learning a new glaze. But the road resists single images because it is a vast ensemble of human actions repeated across centuries. Its history is stitched from small improvisations as much as from great policy decisions. The echoes of the Silk Road continue in kitchens where spices remind us of ancient exchanges, in the crook of a melody that hints at distant lands, and in the architecture of cities that grew where oasis met road. Even if modern highways and cables have changed transportation, the logic of connection, that movement changes people and places, remains unchanged. For anyone wanting to listen to the Silk Road's full story, the task is almost endless because its strands continue to knot and unknot in modern lives. Every historian, traveler, and artisan who studies or walks those routes adds a new stitch, and every policy that references the Silk Road winds fresh threads across an already complex tapestry. To understand it fully is to accept that history is not a single narrative but a chorus of voices. So the Silk Road should be thought of as a living metaphor as much as a set of routes. It represents the human capacity to reach beyond immediate horizons and to form networks that transform food, faith, technology, and identity. In that sense, the road is not only a relic of the past but a pattern that continues to shape the way we move and relate today. Ultimately, the road's lesson is one of consequences and continuities. Trade brought wealth and innovation, but it also carried risk and inequality. Cultural exchange produced masterpieces and conflicts. Political power alternately protected and exploited transit. Remembering the Silk Road requires acknowledging both its splendors and its shadows, so that the present can draw nuanced lessons for a world still negotiating the balances of connection. When you next think of silk, spices, or the map on a museum wall, imagine the voices that once hustled in a market square, the prayers intoned in a monastery cave, and the names of towns written in dusty ledgers. Imagine, too, the modern freight train or fiber cable that carries echoes of the same human impulse to trade and communicate. That impulse, more than any single cargo, is the true thread that binds the Silk Road across centuries. And so the Silk Road remains, not only as a historic phenomenon but as a continuing influence on how regions interact and how cultures reinvent themselves. It survives in the tastes we crave, the languages we borrow from one another, and the legal and financial tools we use to trust someone 1,000 miles away. The road story is embedded in daily acts, in a cup of tea, a musical phrase, a ceramic shard, an ancient manuscript, and in the modern decisions about how to connect and preserve. If the Silk Road still feels alive to you, subscribe and tell us in the comments whether you feel it more in the flavors you taste or in the stories you hear.